Hello, and welcome back to Penplexity, the podcast where we get perplexed by pens, paragraphs, and print. I'm your host, James, and today, oh boy, we're diving nose first into something we literally do all day, every day, breathing. We're looking at the introduction chapter of Breath, the New Science of a Lost Art by James Nestor. And let me tell you, this intro grabbed me right away. To help us unpack it, I've got my favorite dynamic duo back in the studio. First up, the ever insightful and always energetic Sarah.
Hey James! So ready for this one. Honestly, who knew breathing could be so dramatic? The chapter starts like a spooky movie.
Right? Amityville, paint-chipped walls, menacing shadows. I was expecting ghosts, not a breathing class. And rounding out our trio, the man who probably calculates the oxygen to carbon dioxide ratio in his sleep, the brilliant Ethan.
Greetings. While I don't consciously calculate my gas exchange during slumber, James, the premise is fascinating. Breathing is fundamental, yet fundamentally overlooked in many scientific and medical contexts. This intro sets up a compelling dichotomy.
Okay, Sarah, kick us off. Nestor walks into this creepy house for a breathing class. Why? What's his deal at this point?
So Nestor's in a bit of a rut, right? He's stressed, his ancient house is crumbling, and he keeps getting pneumonia, like year after year. His doctor, bless their cotton socks, suggests a breathing class might help. He sounds pretty skeptical, describes the scene hilariously. Prisoner eyes, Jerry Lewis bangs, a woman with an off-center bindi. He's clearly not expecting much.
Yeah, he sounds thoroughly unimpressed. Sitting there, getting annoyed, thinking about leaving. We've all been there in some awkward introductory class, haven't we?
Totally. He's just breathing along to this tape with a, quote, squeaky, lilting voice, feeling nothing. And then bam, something happens. He doesn't even feel it happening, but suddenly he opens his eyes and he's drenched in sweat. Like, soaked.
The physiological response is the first real hook. He explicitly states the room was cool, around 68 degrees Fahrenheit, yet he experienced profuse sweating, akin to intense physical exertion. The instructor mentions breath releasing, quote, old stale energy and bringing in new energy. While metaphorical, it points towards a potential thermogenic or autonomic nervous system response triggered by the specific breathing pattern, the Sudarshan Kriya he mentioned.
Autonomic, like the stuff we don't consciously control, like heart rate and sweating?
Precisely. Breathing is unique because it straddles the conscious and unconscious. We breathe automatically, but we can consciously control it. Techniques like Sudarshan Kriya appear to leverage this connection to influence systems typically considered involuntary. The sweating incident, while anecdotal at this stage, is the catalyst for Nestor's entire investigation.
Exactly. He feels noticeably calmer, sleeps better for days afterwards. It gets him thinking, what exactly had happened? How did just breathing do that? And that curiosity, that personal experience, sends him down this rabbit hole.
A rabbit hole that leads him underwater? Tell us about the freedivers.
Yeah, it's quite a leap. Years later, he's in Greece writing about freedivers, these incredible people who dive hundreds of feet on a single breath. He starts interviewing them, asking how they can hold their breath for like 12 minutes.
Which is significantly beyond typical human capacity and what was previously thought physiologically possible without aids.
Right! And the freedivers tell him it's all about training. They've basically, quote, coaxed their lungs to work harder, tapped into capabilities the rest of us ignore. They insist they aren't special, that anyone can learn. One instructor says something amazing. There are as many ways to breathe as there are foods to eat. And each way we breathe will affect our bodies in different ways. Breathing isn't just passive. It's a tool, a medicine.
Wow, that's a bold claim. Some ways nourish, some kill neurons. Some make you healthy, some hasten death. Intense.
It is intense, and from a purely scientific standpoint, requires rigorous validation. However, the core idea that breathing patterns have distinct physiological effects is plausible. We know, for instance, that hyperventilation and hypoventilation drastically alter blood chemistry, pH, and oxygen delivery. The freediver's perspective frames breathing not just as gas exchange, but as a mechanism for profound physiological control.
They tell him these wild stories too. expanding lung size by 30%, losing weight just by changing inhalation, someone fighting off an E. coli injection with rhythmic breathing, monks melting snow. It sounds totally nuts.
Okay, melting snow? Okay. Ethan, please tell me there's some obscure physics principle involved there.
The Tummo meditation practice. It involves specific breathing techniques and visualizations intended to generate internal heat. Studies have actually documented significant increases in core body temperature in practitioners. It's an extreme example, certainly, but it highlights the potential for breathwork to influence thermoregulation, likely via the autonomic nervous system.
So Nestor hears all this, tries to find modern scientific proof, and hits a wall?
Pretty much, initially. He finds tons of ancient stuff. Chinese Tao texts, Hindu practices, Buddhist techniques, all focused on breath for health, longevity, even higher consciousness. They treated breathing as powerful medicine. But then he looks into modern pulmonology and finds almost nothing. It's like, just get the air in, doesn't matter how.
Yeah, he points out, doctors check everything but your breathing rate or quality in a standard checkup. It's just not on the menu, which seems weird if it's potentially so important.
It reflects a certain paradigm in Western medicine, often focused on pathology and acute intervention. Pulmonology largely deals with specific lung diseases, cancer, emphysema, lung collapse. As one pulmonologist told Nestor, we're dealing with emergencies. Preventative aspects or subtle modulations of function through breathing technique haven't historically been a major focus, though that's slowly changing.
So ancient wisdom says super important. Modern medicine largely says, meh, whatever. How does he reconcile that?
He keeps digging and discovers that cutting-edge research is happening, just not always where you'd expect. It's an anthropology dig studying ancient skulls, dental offices looking at jaw development, even mental hospitals. Researchers are finding that, how we breathe has changed, often for the worse since the industrial age, and that maybe 90% of us are doing it incorrectly.
That 90% figure is provocative. It likely refers to common habits like chronic mouth breathing, shallow chest breathing, or slight hyperventilation, which are prevalent and linked to various issues. The research he alludes to is starting to connect these patterns to modern maladies, asthma, anxiety, ADHD, even autoimmune issues.
And crucially, this research suggests these things can be reduced or even reversed just by changing how we inhale and exhale. It's like rediscovering this lost art, this missing pillar of health.
The missing pillar. I like that. It implies it's foundational, just like diet or exercise.
Totally. Nestor says, no matter what we eat, how much we exercise, how resilient our genes are, none of it will matter unless we're breathing correctly. That's the core message setting up the whole book.
Which brings us neatly to our sponsor for today's episode, folks. It fits perfectly, actually. Penplexity is brought to you by Sharan, Sanctuary for Health and Reconnection to Animals and Nature. Sharan is all about spreading awareness of holistic health and sustainable, compassionate living. They've got doctors, nutritionists, health coaches, all focused on helping you reach your highest health potential through long-term lifestyle changes. Their methods are science-based, tested by doctors, and aimed at empowering you. Much like Nestor suggests breathing is a fundamental lifestyle component we need to get right, Sharan looks at the bigger picture of well-being. They've helped over 100,000 people worldwide. Check them out at www.sharan-india.org.
Yeah, definitely check them out. If this chapter teaches us anything, it's that sometimes the most fundamental aspects of our health, like breathing, or our connection to nature and holistic practices, are the ones we overlook. Sharan seems dedicated to bringing those back into focus.
Indeed. A holistic approach considering lifestyle factors often neglected in conventional settings aligns well with the premise that modulating a basic physiological function like breathing could have systemic health benefits. Supporting organizations that explore these evidence-based broader approaches to health is worthwhile. That's www.sharan-india.org.
Perfect, thanks guys. Okay, let's tackle a few questions that have come in from our listeners. First one, Nestor mentions Sudarshan Kriya, but are there many different types of these ancient breathing techniques, Sarah?
Oh, absolutely. The chapter mentions Taoist, Hindu, and Buddhist traditions, all having their own detailed practices. The freediver instructor compared them to different foods having different effects. So yeah, Sudarshan Kriya is just one specific example he experienced, but the book implies there's a whole world of techniques out there, developed over thousands of years.
Makes sense. Next question. Ethan mentioned breathing straddles the conscious and unconscious. Why is that significant for health? Ethan, over to you.
Excellent question. It's significant because it provides a potential access point. Most autonomic functions, heart rate, digestion, immune response, are largely involuntary. But because we can consciously control our breath, it offers a lever to potentially influence those other autonomic processes. It's a biofeedback mechanism built into our own bodies. Learning to use that lever correctly is the crux of what this lost art seems to be about.
A built-in biofeedback mechanism. Cool. Okay, last question. The chapter mentions modern humans having issues like crooked teeth that our ancestors didn't, and links it to breathing. Can you elaborate a bit?
Nestor teases this. He doesn't fully explain it in the intro, but he promises that by our 1000th breath reading the book, we'll understand why we have crooked teeth and why cavemen didn't snore, and how it relates to breathing. He also mentions a 20-day Stanford study testing nose versus mouth breathing. So it seems like our facial structure, how we breathe, nose versus mouth, and things like snoring and dental health are all interconnected pieces of this puzzle that the book will explore.
The craniofacial development link is a fascinating area. The forces exerted by airflow, tongue posture, and chewing habits influence how our jaws and airways develop. The implication is that changes in lifestyle, diet, and breathing habits over time may have contributed to the dental and airway issues common today.
Okay, mine's slightly blown. Before we wrap up, can one of you give us the key takeaways from this introduction?
I'd say 3 things stand out. 1. Breathing, while automatic, is far from binary. How we breathe has profound physiological consequences, often overlooked by modern medicine, but emphasized in ancient traditions. 2. There's emerging scientific evidence, often from unexpected fields, starting to validate some of these ancient claims and exploring breathing as a therapeutic tool. 3. The author posits that many of us are breathing inefficiently or incorrectly, potentially contributing to modern health issues, setting the stage for an exploration of how to reclaim this lost art.
Perfect summary, Ethan. Reclaiming a lost art. I love that. It makes you want to immediately pay attention to your next inhale, doesn't it?
Totally. Makes you wonder what else we've forgotten.
All right, folks. That's all the time we have for today's Penplexity. What a chapter. It really makes you pause and take a deep breath. So, what should we get perplexed by next time? Let us know. Find us on all the socials at Penplexity, that's Penplexity, or visit our website, penplexity.com. Until next time, keep reading, keep thinking, and maybe keep breathing, but like, consciously. Bye?
Bye, everyone. Breathe well.
Farewell.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to Penplexity, the podcast where we get perplexed by pens. No, wait, that's not right. Where we unravel the complexities of the written word, one chapter at a time. I'm your host, James, and today, oh boy, we are diving headfirst, or maybe nose first, into Breath, the New Science of a Lost Art by James Nestor. Specifically, Part 1, Chapter 1, The Worst Breathers in the Animal Kingdom, which, spoiler alert, might be us. Joining me, as always, are the brilliant minds that keep me slightly less perplexed. We have the ever-insightful and fun Sarah.
Hey, James. Excited to chat about this one. It starts with quite a bang. Or maybe a gasp.
Huh, nice one. And our resident scientist, the man who probably measures his own breath rate for fun, Ethan.
Greetings. Though I assure you, my spirometer usage is purely for professional curiosity, mostly. This chapter certainly sets a provocative stage.
Provocative is one word for it. So, Sarah, kick us off. This chapter opens with Nestor basically giving himself a medical history report, right? And it's not flattering.
Not at all. He describes himself as this product of modern life, bottle-fed, weaned onto super soft processed foods like Velveeta sandwiches and snowballs. Oh my gosh, remember snowballs?
Vividly. Pink, marshmallowy goodness.
Right? But the point he's making is that this lack of chewing, this soft diet from infancy meant his jaw and sinus cavity didn't develop properly. He calls it stunted bone development.
Which is fascinating from a developmental biology perspective. The mechanical stress of chewing is a known factor in stimulating bone growth in the mandible and maxilla. Less stress, less growth stimulus.
Exactly. So his mouth gets crowded, teeth come in crooked, leading to extractions, braces, headgear, the whole 9 yards. And he says the orthodontics, trying to straighten things out in a small space, actually made his mouth even smaller.
Wait, so braces could make things worse for breathing?
Well, he implies that by making the mouth smaller, his tongue didn't fit properly anymore. He even mentions seeing imprints on the side of his tongue, a sign pointing towards future snoring and sleep apnea.
The spatial relationship between the tongue, the palate, and the pharyngeal airway is critical. Reducing the oral cavity volume can indeed displace the tongue posteriorly, especially during sleep when muscle tone decreases, potentially leading to airway obstruction.
Yikes. Okay, so Nestor's got this underdeveloped face, basically, and then he decides to do what exactly, Sarah?
He volunteers for this pretty intense experiment at Stanford with Dr. Jayakar Nayak, a nasal surgeon. The plan? To completely block his nose with silicone plugs and tape for 10 days. 10 days. Forced mouth breathing only.
Just why? That sounds utterly miserable.
Right? He even describes the initial examination, getting an endoscope shoved way up his nose, looking at his own insides on video goggles, while the doctor is poking around. It sounds awful, but the goal was serious. To see what happens when the nose is taken out of the equation.
It's a somewhat brutal but direct way to test the hypothesis. Dr. Nayak, as Nestor points out, believes the nose is vastly underappreciated in Western medicine. While many see it as ancillary, if it's blocked, just use the mouth, Nayak argues those internal structures, the dunes and marshes, as Nestor calls them, are vital.
Okay, I get the scientific curiosity, but who else signs up for 10 days of nasal torture?
Meet Anders Olsson, a breathing therapist from Sweden, who James had interviewed. Apparently, Anders was initially like, "No way!" But his curiosity won out, and he flew over and paid thousands to join this misery party.
Wow. Okay, so the experiment has 2 phases, right?
Phase 1, 10 days of pure mouth breathing. Phase 2, remove the plugs, breathe only through the nose, and practice specific breathing techniques. They took a ton of baseline measurements before starting blood gases, inflammation markers, hormone levels, even bacteria swabs from deep inside the nose.
The bacterial culture comparison is particularly interesting. The hypothesis is that nasal obstruction allows pathogenic bacteria to flourish rapidly. Quantifying that change over just 10 days could provide significant data on the nose's role in immune defense.
Nestor mentions that like 40% of people have chronic nasal obstruction and half of us are habitual mouth breathers. That seems high?
It does, but he links it back to that facial development issue. When mouths don't grow wide enough, the palate grows upwards, creating that V shape or high-arched palate. This shrinks the nasal cavity, leading to obstruction. He finds out he has this and a severely deviated septum, and something called concha bullosa, which Dr. Nayak called super uncommon.
Poor guy. Super uncommon is never good news from a doctor.
Indeed, concha bullosa is the pneumatization, or air filling, of a nasal turbinate, which can contribute significantly to obstruction if large enough. Combined with a deviated septum and a high-arched palate, it paints a picture of significantly compromised nasal airflow.
Okay, let's switch gears slightly. Nestor takes us way, way back, billions of years. Ethan, tell us about eating air.
Yes, the primordial soup buffet. Initially, life ran on carbon dioxide. Early microorganisms metabolized CO2 and released oxygen as waste. Over 1 billion years, this waste built up.
And then other organisms figured out how to use that oxygen waste, right? And that was way more efficient. 16 times more energy.
Precisely. Aerobic respiration. That energy surplus fueled the evolution of larger, more complex life, including mammals, who developed sophisticated respiratory systems, noses to filter and warm air, lungs, efficient gas exchange mechanisms.
So breathing was key to, well, everything complex.
Totally. But then Nestor points out this shift, starting maybe 1.5 million years ago with our ancestors like Homo habilis.
The ones using tools, eating meat.
Yeah! And then Homo erectus, who started cooking food about 800,000 years ago. Cooking made food softer, easier to digest, freeing up energy.
And that surplus energy largely went into growing bigger brains, an incredible evolutionary advantage. But there was a trade-off. The expanding cranium encroached on facial structures. Jaws became weaker, faces shortened, mouths shrank.
So, bigger brains meant smaller airways? That seems like a design flaw.
Evolution doesn't design. It adapts based on immediate pressures. The cognitive advantages of a larger brain evidently outweighed the subtle, long-term disadvantages of slightly compromised airways, at least initially.
Nestor introduces this idea of disevolution from biologist Daniel Lieberman. It means we're adopting and passing down traits that are actually bad for our health, like aching backs, fragile bones, and poor breathing.
Okay, this brings us to the skulls. Sarah, tell us about Dr. Mariana Evans and the Morton collection.
This part blew my mind. Dr. Evans, an orthodontist, studied these skulls in a museum basement, hundreds of them, ancient and modern. The ancient ones, from just a few hundred to thousands of years ago, were basically perfect. Huge jaws growing forward, wide sinus cavities, broad mouths.
And the teeth?
Perfectly straight, every single one, despite no dentists, no fluoride, no floss.
No way. How?
Because their jaws were large enough to fit all their teeth. Their facial structure meant they had wide airways, too. Snoring, sleep apnea? Probably impossible for them. Their airways were too big to get blocked.
This aligns with anthropological findings. Widespread malocclusion, crooked teeth, overbites, underbites, is a relatively recent phenomenon in human history, appearing significantly after the agricultural revolution and intensifying with industrialization and softer diets.
And when Evans compared these to modern skulls, totally opposite. Recessed chins, smaller jaws, shrunken sinuses, and crooked teeth. Nestor says we're basically the only mammal out of 5,400 species that routinely has messed up teeth alignment.
That's embarrassing for us, frankly. So the shift is really tied to softer, processed foods?
That's the strong implication presented. Less chewing, less mechanical loading leads to underdeveloped facial bones over generations.
Okay, there's one more piece. Speech. How did talking mess things up, Ethan?
Another evolutionary trade-off. For complex speech, the human larynx descended lower in the throat compared to other animals and earlier Homo species. This created a larger resonant chamber, the pharynx, allowing for a wider range of sounds.
But that lowered larynx is less efficient at its main job, being a valve to keep food out of the airway. It created this space where food could get stuck, making Homo sapiens the only species prone to choking to death on food.
And that change, along with a more flexible tongue positioned further back and smaller lips, also altered the geometry of the upper airway, contributing to the potential for obstruction during sleep, snoring, and apnea.
So the things that made us dominant, fire, processing food, big brains, language, are the very things that are literally choking us? That's darkly ironic.
Completely. It sets up this tension perfectly. For thousands of years, maybe it was fine. But now, with modern lifestyles exacerbating the problem, we're feeling those ancient trade-offs.
Wow. Okay, let's pause here for a moment. This whole discussion about how our modern environment and lifestyle choices, like processed foods impacting our jaw development and breathing, actually ties in really well with our sponsor. This episode of Pinplexity is brought to you by Sharan, Sanctuary for Health and Reconnection to Animals and Nature. Sharan is all about spreading awareness of holistic health and sustainable, compassionate living. They've got a team of doctors, nutritionists, and health coaches focused on helping people achieve their best health through long-term lifestyle changes grounded in scientific evidence.
That really resonates with this chapter, doesn't it? Looking at the root causes in our lifestyle and environment, Sharan empowers people to make changes for vibrant well-being, and they've helped over 100,000 people worldwide. Definitely check them out.
Indeed. Their focus on evidence-based, long-term change aligns with understanding the deep biological impacts of our choices, as Nestor explores. You can find them at www.sharan.com. sharon-india.org.
Thanks, guys. That's sharon-india.org. Okay, back to Nestor's misery. How bad did it get those first couple of nights with the nose plugs?
Oh, it got bad fast. He talks about being in bed, feeling every blast of dry, unfiltered air hitting his throat. He used a pulse oximeter and a snoring app.
And the results?
After just one night of forced mouth breathing, his snoring went up by 1,300%. He snored for 75 minutes.
1,300%?
Yep, and Anders Olsen, the Swedish guy, he went from 0 snoring to 4 hours and 10 minutes.
Oh my God.
That is a remarkably rapid and drastic physiological response. It underscores how quickly breathing patterns can impact sleep architecture and airway stability.
Nestor also had a 4-fold increase in sleep apnea events, moments where he stopped breathing, all within 24 hours of blocking his nose. He ends the chapter lying awake, coughing, wheezing, thinking about cavemen, with 175,000 more mouth breaths to go.
Geez. What a cliffhanger. Okay, let's take some questions from our listeners. First question. You mentioned Nestor linked orthodontics to making his mouth smaller. Does the book say if braces always make breathing worse, or just in his specific case? Sarah?
That's a great question. In this chapter, Nestor focuses on his personal experience and suggests that his orthodontics, aimed at straightening teeth in an already underdeveloped jaw, potentially involving extractions, contributed to making his mouth smaller. He doesn't make a blanket statement that all orthodontics are bad, but he definitely plants a seed that traditional approaches might not always consider airway space, especially if the underlying issue is jaw size.
Okay, interesting nuance. Next question. So much focus on ancient humans and soft foods. Is the main takeaway just that we should all start chewing rocks and eating raw antelope like cavemen? Ethan, what do you think?
While illustrative, the chapter isn't prescribing a literal Paleolithic diet or lifestyle. The key insight is understanding the principle that the reduced mechanical load from modern soft processed diets has contributed to structural changes in our faces and airways over time. It prompts consideration of how modern practices impact fundamental biology, rather than advocating for a direct return to ancient habits, which is impractical and ignores other aspects of progress.
Right, it's about the why, not necessarily a call to gnaw on bones. Good. Last question. This all sounds pretty depressing. Shrinking faces, bad breathing. Does the chapter offer any hope? Can these problems be reversed? Sarah.
This first chapter primarily sets up the problem and the experiment. It highlights the negative consequences and the historical context. While it doesn't detail solutions yet, the whole premise of Nestor's book, and the fact he's undertaking this experiment with a phase 2 focused on nasal breathing techniques, strongly implies that improvement is possible. It leaves you hanging, wanting to know if switching back to nasal breathing can undo some of the damage.
Okay, so hope is on the horizon, presumably in later chapters. Perfect. So wrapping up this chapter, Ethan, could you give us the key takeaways?
Certainly. I'd highlight 4 main points from this chapter. 1. The nose is presented not as an optional extra, but a critical organ for healthy respiration, performing vital functions ignored by habitual mouth breathing. 2. Modern human faces and airways are structurally different, often smaller and more obstructed, compared to our ancestors, largely linked to changes in diet and reduced chewing B. 3. This isn't necessarily progress. The concept of disevolution suggests we've developed traits detrimental to breathing. 4. The negative health impacts of mouth breathing, like increased snoring and sleep apnea, can manifest surprisingly quickly, as demonstrated by the experiment's initial results.
Excellent summary. Wow, what a start to the book. It definitely makes you think about every breath you take. All right, that's all the time we have for this episode of Penplexity. Huge thanks to Sarah and Ethan for dissecting that dense chapter with me.
Always a pleasure, James.
Likewise.
What book or topic should we get perplexed by next? Let us know. Find us on social media at Penplexity. That's PENPLEXITY. Or visit our website at penplexity.com. Until next time, keep reading, keep thinking, and maybe try breathing through your nose. Bye, everyone. Hey, everyone, and welcome back to Penplexity, the podcast where we get tangled up in the fascinating world of words and ideas. I'm your host, James, and as always, I've got my brilliant buddies, Sarah and Ethan here.
Hey! Ready to unravel some penplexities?
Hello, James, Sarah. Always a pleasure to apply some scientific rigor to the proceedings.
Love it. Okay, so today we're diving into Chapter 2 of James Nestor's Breath. This one's called Mouth Breathing. And folks, buckle up, because it gets a little weird, and honestly, kind of gross.
Oh, it's wild! So Nestor and this researcher, Anders Olsen, they decide to do this experiment on themselves. For 10 days straight, they completely block their noses. Like silicone plugs, tape, the works. Forcing themselves to breathe only through their mouths, 24/7.
Just hearing that makes my nose itch. Why? Why would anyone do that to themselves?
For science, James. Or perhaps journalistic masochism. The stated goal was to directly experience and measure the physiological effects of chronic mouth breathing versus nasal breathing. They meticulously tracked things like blood pressure, heart rate variability, pulse, body temperature, you name it.
And the results were, not good. Nestor says his blood pressure shot up 13 points, straight into stage 1 hypertension. His heart rate variability plummeted, meaning his body was basically screaming stress, pulse up, temperature down, mental clarity, totally in the toilet.
He describes Olsen looking like Gary Busey in that police mugshot. Gaunt, sallow, haunted grin. Yikes.
Yeah, and they felt awful. Nestor calls it a, quote, groundhog day of perpetual and unending misery. Just sitting alone in their apartments, hating life, trying different ways to plug their noses, chewing gum, toilet paper. It sounds dreadful.
The iterative process of finding the least atrocious nasal occlusion method, silicone plugs plus surgical tape, apparently highlights their commitment, however unpleasant.
And people noticed. He talks about trying to go outside and getting stopped by people like his contractor, Antonio.
Right. Antonio basically tells him, dude, this is a bad idea. He said where he grew up in Mexico, teachers would literally smack kids on the head for mouth breathing because it's seen as unhealthy and disrespectful. He mentioned his own family members struggling with chronic obstruction after being mouth breathers.
There's an interesting sociocultural layer there. In some cultures, there's an ingrained understanding, passed down generationally, that nasal breathing is the correct, healthy default. Something largely lost in many modern Western societies.
Totally. Nestor even mentions another guy, David, stopping them during a jog, sharing his lifelong struggles with nasal congestion and respiratory problems after years of mouth breathing. Nestor started avoiding going out because everyone either questioned him or shared their breathing sob story.
Which is funny in San Francisco, a city that supposedly loves weirdos. But plugged noses were apparently too much. He even noticed everyone at the gym was mouth breathing.
An observation that perhaps speaks volumes about our default respiratory habits, even during exertion.
Speaking of exertion, the bike experiment. Olsen's idea, right?
Yeah. Olsen was really into the athletic performance side. They decided to test how mouth breathing versus nasal breathing affected endurance. So they get on stationary bikes at the gym.
While still plugged up, mind you.
Oh yeah, still fully mouth breathing. They based it on studies by a Dr. John Deweyar from the 90s. He tested pro cyclists. Mouth breathing, they panted like crazy. Nasal breathing, their breathing rate decreased as intensity went up. One guy went from 47 breaths per minute mouth breathing down to 14 nasal breathing at the same high intensity.
The implication being significantly increased efficiency and reduced perceived exertion through nasal breathing.
Exactly. Nestor tries it himself. He uses the Maffetone method. That's 180 minus your age to find your max aerobic heart rate, to keep his heart rate steady at 136 beats per minute.
Okay, wait. Aerobic, anaerobic. Can you break that down a bit, Sarah?
Sure. So your body makes energy in two main ways. Aerobic means with oxygen. It's super efficient, clean burning, uses fat and glucose. Think long-haul energy. Anaerobic means without oxygen. It just uses glucose. It's fast, like a turbo boost, but it's messy. It produces lactic acid, which is why you feel awful when you push too hard, too fast. Your body hasn't caught up with oxygen supply.
Mouth breathing, particularly during exertion, tends to trigger a sympathetic nervous system response, fight or flight, and encourages shallower, faster breathing, often pushing the body prematurely towards that inefficient lactic acid-producing anaerobic state.
Right, so Nestor, trying to stay aerobic while mouth breathing? After half an hour of huffing and puffing, feeling bleary-eyed and sweaty, he only managed 6.44 miles. Pretty dismal.
Okay, the bike stuff sounds intense, but is this really a big deal for someone like me who just, walks the dog? Not exactly hitting 200 watts here.
Oh, absolutely. It's about efficiency, James. Even at rest, mouth breathing stresses your system. Look at his blood pressure spiking, just sitting around. Nasal breathing keeps things calm, uses energy better, conditions the air, whether you're sprinting or sleeping.
Precisely. It's about the default state. While peak performance highlights the difference dramatically, the underlying physiological strain of mouth breathing is chronic, impacting baseline health, sleep quality, even cognitive function over time, regardless of athletic prowess. It's the cumulative effect.
Interesting point. Thinking about overall health and making positive changes, this feels like a good moment to talk about our sponsor, Sharan. Sharan, that's the Sanctuary for Health and Reconnection to Animals and Nature, is all about spreading awareness about holistic health and an ecologically sustainable, compassionate lifestyle. They've got doctors, nutritionists, health coaches, all working towards building a culture of health. Their mission is to help you reach your highest health potential by empowering you with long-term lifestyle changes. And their methods? Used and tested by doctors, based on scientific evidence. Now part of mainstream knowledge worldwide. Honestly, after reading this chapter, realizing how something as basic as how you breathe impacts everything from your blood pressure to your sleep, it really drives home that holistic point, doesn't it?
It totally does. It's about looking at the whole system, not just isolated symptoms. Sharan focuses on empowering people with knowledge for long-term change. And understanding your breathing seems like such a fundamental, foundational piece of that puzzle. They've helped over 100,000 people.
Indeed, their emphasis on scientific evidence aligns well. The principles discussed here, physiological impacts of breathing patterns, are rooted in observable science. We encourage everyone interested in vibrant well-being to check out their resources. Welcome a life of vibrant well-being. Find them at www.sharon-india.org.
Definitely do that. That's www.sharon-india.org. Okay, back to the mouth-breathing nightmare. Ethan, you mentioned chronic effects. This chapter gets into some really disturbing long-term stuff involving monkeys?
Ah, yes. The infamous Harvold experiments from the 70s and 80s. Ethically, problematic by today's standards, certainly. Eagle Harvold took rhesus monkeys and, similar to Nestor's experiment, plugged their nasal passages with silicone, forcing them into chronic mouth breathing.
And the results were shocking. Over months, even up to 2 years, the mouth-breathing monkeys developed these changes. Their faces grew longer, jaws receded, dental arches narrowed, teeth got crooked. They looked slack-jawed and glazed over. The photos are apparently heart-wrenching.
How does just breathing through your mouth do that?
It's physics, apparently. According to experts like Patrick McEwen quoted in the book, inhaling through the mouth decreases pressure in the airway. This causes the soft tissues at the back, the palate, the throat tissues, to become loose and sort of collapse inward. Less space makes breathing harder, which encourages more mouth breathing. It's a vicious cycle.
Conversely, nasal breathing creates appropriate pressure, forcing air against those tissues, effectively toning them over time. This helps maintain a wider, more stable airway structure. Nasal breathing begets more nasal breathing. As McEwen says, the nose, mouth, airways, lungs. It's one united airway.
Wow. So the way you breathe literally shapes your face and throat.
The evidence presented strongly suggests so. Harvold's work, though controversial, provides a stark visual model of the potential developmental consequences, reflecting patterns orthodontists like Mariana Evans see in human patients today.
Okay, let's talk about sleep. Because Nestor's sleep went completely off the rails.
Oh my gosh, yes. His snoring increased by, get this, 4,820%. He started having obstructive sleep apnea for the first time, like actually choking in his sleep multiple times a night, causing his oxygen levels to drop dangerously low.
That sounds terrifying.
Totally. He describes feeling like he was being, quote, to softly choked to death. And it makes sense. When you sleep with your mouth open, gravity pulls your tongue and soft tissues back, obstructing the airway even more than when you're awake.
This chronic obstruction and oxygen deprivation during sleep has well-documented links to serious health issues: heart failure, depression, memory problems, high blood pressure, even potentially cancer and diabetes.
And the peeing. This was fascinating. Deep sleep triggers the release of vasopressin, a hormone that tells your kidneys to conserve water. But if you're constantly waking up or not getting deep sleep because of apnea or mouth breathing, you don't produce enough vasopressin. So your kidneys release water, making you thirsty and needing to pee all night. Nestor experienced this constantly.
Ah, that explains the dry mouth and the constant bathroom trips.
Indeed, it also connects to findings mentioned from the Mayo Clinic, suggesting chronic insomnia is often, at its root, a breathing problem. And research by Christian Guilleminault indicates that even, quote, heavy breathing or light snoring in children without full apnea events can lead to mood disorders, learning disabilities, and blood pressure issues. No amount of snoring is truly normal.
It even made him dumber?
Well, dumber might be strong, but cognitively impaired, yes. He mentions a Japanese study where mouth-breathing rats developed fewer brain cells and were slower in mazes, and another in humans linked mouth-breathing to disturbed oxygen flow in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain linked to things like ADHD.
This aligns with ancient wisdom too. A passage from the Tao is quoted, calling breath through the mouth Nietzsche, adverse breath, warning it's, quote, extremely harmful.
So Harvold's monkeys, Nestor feeling awful, the snoring, the brain fog. Sounds pretty grim. If you've been a mouth breather forever, are you just stuck with a long face and bad sleep?
Not necessarily stuck. The body exhibits remarkable plasticity. While developmental changes are certainly more profound and perhaps easier to influence in youth, physiological function can often be improved or retrained at any age. Think of it less as immutable damage and more as maladaptive conditioning that can, potentially, be reversed with the right stimuli.
Exactly. And that's where the chapter offers some hope. Nestor meets this orthodontist, Mariana Evans. She studies ancient human skulls, which tend to have perfect teeth, wide jaws, big nasal apertures, and compares them to modern people.
Like us, with our crooked teeth and stuffy noses.
Pretty much. She shows him photos of a young patient, Gigi. First photo, classic mouth breather look, crooked teeth, dark circles under the eyes, chapped open lips, suffering from snoring, sinusitis, asthma, allergies.
Despite having a healthy lifestyle otherwise.
Right. But then Evan shows a photo taken 2 years later, after treatment focused on restoring proper nasal breathing. Gigi is transformed. Straight teeth, glowing skin, no dark circles, breathing through her nose. Her respiratory issues, mostly gone.
This aligns with the conclusion of Harvold's research as well. After the nasal plugs were removed, the monkeys gradually relearned nasal breathing. Over time, their facial structures and airways began to remodel back towards their normal state. 6 months later, they, quote, looked like monkeys again.
Wow, okay. So there's actual hope for remodeling?
It seems so. Evans and others are described as, quote, pulmonauts, exploring therapies to help people regain that proper airway function, essentially helping us return to our more perfect ancient forms.
It suggests that function dictates form to a significant degree. Restoring proper nasal breathing function can, over time, influence the physical structure and improve overall health outcomes. It's a message of potential agency over our physiology.
Incredible. Okay, let's take a few questions from our listeners. First one is from Alex in Ohio. Is it ever okay to mouth breathe like during really intense exercise? Ethan, what do you think?
Briefly, perhaps during maximal exertion, the body might reflexively switch to mouth breathing to gulp air. However, the research presented, like Douillard's cyclist study, strongly suggests that training oneself to maintain nasal breathing, even during high intensity, yields significant benefits in efficiency and endurance. The goal should be to expand nasal breathing capacity, not to normalize mouth breathing during exercise.
Makes sense. Next question, from Chloe in London. I snore quite a bit but generally feel okay during the day. Is it really that bad? Sarah?
Well, according to the experts Nestor cites, like Dr. Guilleminault, even snoring or heavy breathing without full-blown apnea isn't really normal or harmless. It can still indicate, quote, increased respiratory effort that might be linked to other issues, maybe subtly affecting mood, focus, or blood pressure. The chapter mentions that a huge percentage of sleep apnea cases go undiagnosed, so feeling okay might not be the whole story. It's probably worth investigating if it's consistent.
Good advice. Okay, last one. From Ben in Sydney. Can I really change my face shape as an adult just by changing how I breathe?
The evidence from Harvold's monkeys and Evans's patients certainly suggests that airway remodeling is possible through restoring nasal breathing. While the most dramatic structural changes likely occur during developmental years, the principle that function dictates form likely still applies in adulthood, albeit perhaps more slowly or subtly. Improving muscle tone in the airway, reducing inflammation, and optimizing physiological function through nasal breathing can certainly lead to significant health improvements, and potentially some positive aesthetic changes over time, even if a complete structural overhaul isn't feasible.
Fascinating stuff. Okay, before we wrap up, Sarah, could you give us the elevator pitch? What are the absolute key takeaways from this mouth breathing chapter?
Okay, key takeaways. 1. Forced mouth breathing, even for just days, has immediate and pretty widespread negative consequences. Higher blood pressure, more stress, worse sleep, brain fog, lousy athletic performance. 2. Nasal breathing is crucial. It's not just an alternative, it's how we're meant to breathe for optimal health, efficiency, and filtering/warming air. 3. Mouth breathing physically changes your airways for the worse, contributing to things like snoring, apnea, and even facial development issues. But 4. There's hope. Evidence suggests these negative changes can often be improved or even reversed by consciously retraining yourself to breathe nasally.
Awesome summary, Sarah. Thank you. And thank you, Ethan, for the insights.
My pleasure.
Always fun.
All right, folks, that's all the time we have for today's Penplexity. What rabbit hole should we jump down next? Let us know. You can find us on social media at Penplexity, that's PENPLEXITY, or visit our website, penplexity.com. Until next time, keep breathing, preferably through your nose. Bye now. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Penplexity, the podcast where we get perplexed by pens, pages, and fascinating ideas. I'm your host, James, and today, oh boy, we're diving nose first, literally, into Chapter 3 of James Nestor's Breath. This one's called simply Nose. And who better to sniff out the details with me than our resident book guru, the ever-effervescent Sarah, and our very own witty wizard of why, Ethan.
Hey James, so ready for this one. After the last chapter's mouth-breathing horror show, I was desperate to see Nestor get those plugs out.
Indeed, the physiological pendulum swing promised to be illuminating. Hello, everyone.
Illuminating is one word for it. Nestor goes back to Stanford, and the doctor basically says, "You look like shit." Which, I mean, fair enough after 10 days of deliberate mouth breathing, right?
Oh, totally. And the description, Nestor says his nasal passages went from smooth desert dunes to being hit by a hurricane. It sounds just awful. Soupy, the doctor called it. Ew.
It highlights the immediate and rather dramatic inflammatory response the nasal tissues experienced when bypassed. The body essentially treated the nasal cavity as defunct, leading to congestion and, well, soupiness upon re-exposure to airflow and assessment tools like that RNA brush.
Right, that brush. Sounds delightful. But the real kicker for me was when he finally could breathe through his nose again later that night. He steps outside and boom! Sensory overload.
Yes, that part was beautiful. He smells the old sock stink of mud, the black label chapstick of the damp doormat, the lemon tree. It's like his world went from black and white to technicolor, all through his nose. He calls it a technicolor burst, like a Seurat painting.
Olfaction, our sense of smell, is profoundly primal. It's deeply wired into the limbic system, affecting memory and emotion directly. What Nestor experienced was likely a combination of sensory deprivation, rebound, and the simple yet profound intimacy of nasal breathing, connecting him directly to the molecular information of his environment.
He gets pretty philosophical there. Respiration is, at its core, reciprocation. taking in bits of the world, giving bits back out. It's more than just oxygen, apparently.
Exactly. And that sets up his mission for the rest of the book, right? To heal the damage and explore how breathing, specifically nasal breathing, can restore health. Step 1. Just breathe through your nose, day and night.
Simple, yet not so simple for many of us. But why is the nose so darn important? We know it filters and warms the air, but Nestor lists some wild stuff.
Oh yeah, beyond the basics. He mentions links to erectile dysfunction, triggering hormones that lower blood pressure, easing digestion, regulating heart rate, storing memories, even responding to menstrual cycles. And nasal hair density affecting asthma risk? Wild.
The nose is a remarkably complex organ, far more than just an air intake. Its mucous membranes and vascular tissues are intrinsically linked to the autonomic nervous system, influencing everything from cardiovascular tone to hormonal cascades. The erectile dysfunction link, for instance, relates to shared tissue types and autonomic control.
Wait, erectile tissue? Like, the nose gets erections? Seriously?
Laughing. Yes, Nestor points out it's the same kind of tissue as, elsewhere. It can engorge with blood super fast. He even mentions honeymoon rhinitis, people getting sneezy and congested just thinking about sex.
Honeymoon rhinitis. That's inconvenient. Okay, so this tissue leads into another weird nose thing. Nasal cycles?
This German doctor, Richard Kaiser, noticed it back in 1895. One nostril gets a bit congested and closes off, while the other opens up, and then they switch every, 30 minutes to a few hours.
It's a fascinating phenomenon. The theories varied: preventing bed sores by making you switch sides in sleep, infection control, enhancing smell. What we now understand is its connection to balancing the autonomic nervous system.
Okay, break that down. Left nostril, right nostril. Gas pedal and brake?
That's Nestor's analogy. Breathing mainly through the right nostril activates the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response. It speeds things up: circulation, body temp, heart rate, blood pressure. It's linked to the left brain. Logic, language.
Conversely, the left nostril engages the parasympathetic system, rest and digest. It cools the body, lowers blood pressure, reduces anxiety, and is linked more to the right brain. Creativity, emotions, abstract thought.
So the way you're breathing through your nose right now could be affecting your mood and how your brain's working?
Precisely. The body strives for homeostasis, a balance between these states, and the nasal cycle appears to be a key regulator. Nestor mentions a study suggesting schizophrenic symptoms might correlate with excessive left nostril dominance, potentially overstimulating the, quote, a creative right brain.
And there are yoga practices like Nadi Shodhana, alternate nostril breathing, designed to consciously manipulate this. Nestor tried it, blocking one nostril, breathing through the other. He felt clarity, relaxation, but said the effects were pretty temporary.
Yeah, I can see that being a bit fiddly to do all day. Maybe just letting the nose do its natural cycling thing is better?
That's what Nestor found. The real transformation came from just letting his nose breathe naturally again. His blood pressure dropped massively, heart rate variability soared, CO2 levels normalized, just from switching back from mouth to nose breathing.
Okay, sponsor time. Speaking of simple, natural things having a big impact, this episode is brought to you by Snoring, the sanctuary for health and reconnection to animals and nature. Snoring is all about spreading awareness of holistic health and sustainable, compassionate living. They've got doctors, nutritionists, health coaches, all focused on empowering you to make long-term lifestyle changes for vibrant well-being, based on scientific evidence. It kind of ties into what we're talking about, right? How something as fundamental as how you breathe, something totally natural, can have these huge health effects, just like the lifestyle changes Snoring promotes.
Totally. It's about getting back to basics that support our body's natural intelligence. Snoring helps people do that through books, talks, workshops, consultations. They've helped over 100,000 people. Definitely check them out at snoring-india.org.
Their focus on evidence-based, long-term change aligns well with understanding the physiological impacts we're discussing. Small, consistent adjustments, like nasal breathing or dietary shifts Snoring might recommend, can yield significant health benefits. Worth exploring. www.sharan-india.org.
Awesome. Thanks, Sharan. Okay, back to the nose's incredible architecture. Nestor uses this analogy, shoving a billiard ball into your face.
Yeah, laughs. It sounds weird, but it illustrates the sheer volume inside your nasal passages, about 6 cubic inches. And the air doesn't just go straight in, it gets swirled around by these maze-like bones called turbinates, or nasal concha, because they look like seashells.
These turbinates dramatically increase the surface area and air turbulence. This forces the air to make contact with the mucous membranes, which, as mentioned, warm, humidify, and filter the air.
And that mucus isn't static. It's like this constantly moving conveyor belt, pushed along by millions of tiny hairs called cilia, sweeping debris down your throat to be nuked by stomach acid. It moves half an inch a minute.
The cilia is coordinated. Wave-like beating is remarkable. They can even propel mucus against gravity. This entire system ensures the air reaching the lungs is optimally conditioned for gas exchange, which is why nasal breathing allows us to absorb about 18% more oxygen compared to mouth breathing.
18%? That's huge. No wonder Nestor calls the nose the silent warrior. It seems the ancients knew this stuff too.
Definitely. Egyptian papyri, Genesis, Taoist texts. They all emphasized breathing through the nose, the heavenly door, warning against mouth breathing. But Nestor credits this guy, George Catlin, for bringing it to Western attention in the 19th century.
Ah, yes. Catlin the artist left his boring lawyer job, went west, painted Native American tribes.
And was blown away by their health. He visited like 50 tribes. Lakota Sioux, Cheyenne, Mandan. Different diets, customs, looks, but universally amazing health. Tall, strong, perfect teeth. Rarely sick.
Catlin's observations are fascinating, though as a scientist, I'd caution separating correlation from causation. While their breathing habits were likely a significant factor, genetics, diet, lifestyle, lack of exposure to certain European diseases also played roles.
Fair point. But Catlin was convinced their great secret was breathing. They believed mouth breathing sapped strength and caused disease, while nasal breathing built health and beauty.
And they practiced it from birth. Mothers would gently close babies' lips after feeding, pinch them shut if they opened during sleep. They actively trained nasal breathing as a lifelong habit. Catlin said they wouldn't even smile with an open mouth.
This concept of training aligns with modern understanding of neuromuscular pathways and habit formation. Consistent nasal breathing would strengthen the relevant musculature and tissues.
Catlin even tested it himself, right? He was apparently a sickly guy.
Totally. Respiratory problems, spitting blood. He forced himself to nose breathe day and night, and boom, health restored. He lived to 76, double the average life expectancy then, and credited nasal breathing. His big motto? Shut your mouth. He wanted it engraved on every bedpost.
Ha! Love it! Which brings us to tape.
Mouth taping. Yep, Nestor explores this modern take on Catlin's advice. He talks to a dentist, Dr. Burhen, and a Stanford speech pathologist, Ann Kearney, who both swear by it.
The rationale is compelling. Mouth breathing dries the mouth, altering the oral microbiome, contributing to cavities, gum disease, and bad breath. It's also strongly linked to snoring and sleep apnea, which have systemic health consequences.
And Kearney's point about, quote, use it or lose it. Her own nasal passages opened up after she forced herself to nose breathe with tape, overcoming chronic congestion. If you don't use your nose, the tissues can atrophy.
Nestor mentions a key benefit, nitric oxide. That stuff Viagra uses?
Correct. Nitric oxide is a vasodilator produced in the paranasal sinuses. Nasal breathing significantly increases its concentration in the airways, improving circulation, oxygen delivery, immune function. It's a crucial molecule. Nasal breathing boosts it sixfold.
So taping your mouth shut at night forces nasal breathing, giving you that nitric oxide boost, better oxygen, potentially less snoring and apnea.
Exactly. Nestor and Olson tried it. Nestor went from snoring for hours to just 10 minutes. 0 apnea events. Olson went from snoring half the night and having 53 apneas to 0 snoring and 0 apneas, just with a tiny piece of tape.
He mentions trying different tapes. Painter's tape, Scotch tape, duct tape. Some people are intense.
Laughing, right? But he landed on just a small, postage stamp-sized piece of gentle surgical tape, like 3M Next Care, right at the center of the lips. Enough to keep them sealed but not feel totally claustrophobic.
While the results Nestor reports are impressive, it's important to note that mouth taping isn't a medically recognized cure for severe sleep apnea, which often requires CPAP or other interventions. However, for simple snoring or mild apnea related to mouth breathing, it appears potentially beneficial by promoting the physiologically superior nasal route.
Good clarification. So it helped him sleep soundly, no waking up to pee, apparently because nasal breathing helps release vasopressin?
Yes, vasopressin is an antidiuretic hormone released by the pituitary gland, primarily during deeper sleep stages. It helps regulate water balance. Disrupted sleep, often caused by breathing issues like mouth breathing or apnea, can interfere with its release, leading to nocturia or waking up to urinate.
So, better breathing leads to better sleep, which leads to proper hormone release. It's all connected.
Incredible stuff. Okay, let's take a few questions from our listeners. First one, is mouth taping actually safe? What if my nose gets blocked in the night? Ethan, maybe you can tackle that.
That's a valid concern. Generally, using a small piece of tape with gentle adhesive, as Nestor describes, allows for easy removal if needed. Most people find that if severe congestion occurs, the pressure will push the lips open, or they'll simply remove the tape subconsciously or consciously. However, individuals with severe nasal obstruction, certain respiratory conditions, or anxiety about it should exercise caution and perhaps consult a healthcare professional first. Starting with short durations during the day can help build tolerance and confidence.
Good advice. Next question. Okay, the stuff about blood pressure and mood is interesting, but can nasal breathing really affect things like erectile dysfunction? Sarah?
Well, according to Nestor and the science he presents, yes. Remember that shared erectile tissue and the autonomic nervous system connection? Plus, the huge boost in nitric oxide from nasal breathing is exactly how drugs like Viagra work, by increasing nitric oxide to improve blood flow. So while it might not be a magic bullet for everyone, optimizing your breathing seems to be a fundamental piece of the puzzle for overall physiological function, including sexual function.
Fascinating connection. Okay, last one. I feel like my nose is always blocked. Does the use it or lose it thing mean I can train it to open up just by trying to breathe through it more?
That's basically what Ann Kearney, the speech pathologist, found for herself. She had chronic congestion, but forcing nasal breathing with tape eventually trained her nasal tissues to open up. Now, if there's a structural issue like a deviated septum or severe allergies, you might need medical intervention. But for general stuffiness or congestion from disuse, yes, gently and persistently trying to favor nasal breathing, maybe starting with practices like alternate nostril breathing or even trying the tape, could potentially help retrain and open up those passages over time. Consistency seems key.
Awesome answers. Okay, wrapping up this deep dive into the nose. Sarah or Ethan, can one of you give us the main takeaways from this chapter?
Certainly, the key points are: 1. Nasal breathing is physiologically superior to mouth breathing, offering better oxygen absorption, filtration, humidification, and temperature regulation. 2. The nose is intricately connected to the autonomic nervous system, influencing heart rate, blood pressure, mood, and even hormonal balance via mechanisms like nasal cycling and nitric oxide production. 3. Historical practices and modern proponents like Catlin and contemporary doctors highlight the long-recognized health benefits. And 4. Simple practices, even including mouth taping for some, can potentially encourage nasal breathing and yield significant improvements in sleep quality and overall health metrics, reinforcing the use it or lose it principle for nasal function.
Brilliant summary, Ethan. So basically, your nose is amazing. Use it. Shut your mouth, as Catlin would say. All right, that's all the time we have for this episode of Penplexity. Huge thanks to Sarah and Ethan for navigating the nasal labyrinth with me.
Always a pleasure, James.
Likewise.
What perplexes you? Let us know what topics or book chapters you want us to tackle next. Find us on social media at Penplexity or visit our website, penplexity.com. Until next time, keep breathing through your nose. Hello, and welcome back to Penplexity, the podcast where we get, well, perplexed by the written word. I'm your host, James, and today, oh boy, we have a breather of a chapter. Literally, we're diving into Chapter 4, titled Simply Exhale, from James Nestor's fascinating book, Breath. And who better to help us unpack this than our regulars, the ever-insightful Sarah and the brilliantly skeptical Ethan.
Hey James, excited to be back. And yeah, exhale. It sounds simple, but this chapter, wow, it really packs a punch. Or maybe a full breath?
Greetings. Simple title, complex implications. Nestor doesn't just talk about breathing out. He links it to longevity, physical structure, even athletic performance. It's ambitious.
Ambitious indeed. So Sarah, Nestor starts off talking about doing these stretches. The 5 Tibetan rites, every morning aiming for immortality, which, sign me up. What's the deal with those?
Right? Who wouldn't want a bit more immortal? So these 5 Tibetan rites, the story goes, came via this writer Peter Kelder, who heard about them from an old British colonel, Colonel Bradford. This colonel supposedly found a monastery in the Himalayas. You know, the classic Shangri-La story, where monks had these secret practices to reverse aging.
Yes, the apocryphal Fountain of Youth narrative, conveniently located in an inaccessible region. Kelder's story about the colonel returning looking 20 years younger is, let's say, difficult to verify scientifically. Though Nestor himself acknowledges it was likely, quote, fabricated, or at minimum grossly exaggerated.
Totally, Ethan. The story's pretty wild. But Nestor's point, and what Kelder described in his booklet, The Eye of Revelation, is that the exercises themselves, these stretches, have roots in actual Tibetan practices dating back millennia. They weren't just pulling Kelder's leg entirely. These methods were believed to boost fitness, mental health, and, potentially extend life by focusing on things like expanding lung capacity.
Okay, so maybe not literal immortality, but expanding lung capacity. Is there actually, science behind that part? The whole bigger lungs, longer life thing?
Surprisingly, yes, to a degree. Nestor brings up the Framingham study, a major long-term heart disease study. They analyzed data from over 5,000 people for 2 decades and found that the single greatest predictor of lifespan wasn't genetics or diet or exercise, it was lung capacity. A follow-up University of Buffalo study confirmed this.
Exactly. Literally a measure of living capacity, that's what the Framingham researchers called it. The smaller and less efficient your lungs got, the quicker people got sick and died. Bigger lungs equaled longer lives. It's pretty stark.
Wow, okay. But, wait, didn't we used to think lungs were just, fixed? Like, you get what you get and they just decline after 30?
That was the prevailing belief in Western medicine, until relatively recently, yes. The assumption was that organs were immutable, destined to degrade. Bones in the chest thin, rib cages collapse inward, muscles weaken, capacity shrinks, about 12% from 30 to 50, and faster after that, leading to faster, shallower breathing, high blood pressure, immune issues, the whole cascade.
But, and this is the hopeful part Nestor emphasizes, what ancient practices hinted at and what science now supports is that organs, including lungs, are malleable. They can be changed, strengthened. He points to freedivers, like Herbert Nietzsche, who apparently has a 14-liter lung capacity, more than double the average. They didn't start that way. They trained their lungs, stretched them, essentially willed them larger.
14 liters? My goodness. Okay, so you don't need to dive hundreds of feet, right? Please tell me I don't need to do that.
No, thankfully. Nestor says even moderate exercise, like walking or cycling, can boost lung size by up to 15%. And then he tells this incredible story about Katharina Schroth.
Oh yeah, the woman with scoliosis? That story blew my mind.
Right? Diagnosed with severe scoliosis in the early 1900s, basically told she had no hope, destined for a life in bed. But she had this idea. She watched balloons inflate and deflate, push and pull. She thought, what if my lungs could do that to my skeleton?
Conceptually, it's fascinating. Applying an internal pneumatic force to reshape the musculoskeletal structure, she developed what she called orthopedic breathing, standing in front of a mirror, twisting, consciously inhaling into specific parts of her lungs, arching her chest to loosen the rib cage.
She did this for 5 years. And according to the book, she essentially cured herself, breathed her spine straight again. Then she started teaching others, opening an institute for severe scoliosis patients, people the hospitals had given up on.
And the medical community, they weren't fans at first, were they?
Not at all. They derided her, said she wasn't qualified. But her results? Women who were bedridden started walking, gained inches in height, could breathe fully again. Eventually, the medical community came around, and she even got Germany's Federal Cross of Merit.
It's a compelling anecdote. Although the precise mechanism and the degree to which, quote, breathing alone straightened the spine versus associated postural changes and exercises warrants careful study. But her longevity, dying just shy of 91 after such a severe diagnosis, is certainly suggestive.
It makes you think about that Chinese adage Nestor quotes, "When the breath is perfect, the form is perfect too." Okay, so breathing can potentially reshape us. But the chapter title is Exhale. Where does that come in? Enter Carl Stoff.
Ah, Carl Stoff, the mysterious choir conductor. Yeah, this is where the focus really shifts. Lynn Martin, who worked with him for decades, becomes Nestor's link to this guy. Stoff noticed singers gasping, holding breath high in the chest, weak voices, because their exhalations were weak.
His insight was that vocalization happens on the exhale. Weak exhale, weak voice. He started training singers to exhale properly, strengthening respiratory muscles, enlarging lungs. His choirs won competitions. He retrained Met Opera singers.
And then he gets a call from the VA hospital about emphysema patients?
Exactly. Dr. Small from the East Orange VA hospital basically said, "You must know something we don't." Stoff goes there and is horrified. Patients are jaundiced, pale, mouths open, oxygen tubes, just waiting to die. Emphysema, this gradual lung deterioration, had no cure.
And Stoff had a different idea about what was wrong.
Yes, he realized the nurses, trying to help by propping patients up to ease inhalation, were maybe making it worse. He saw emphysema primarily as a disease of exhalation. They couldn't get the stale air out.
This connects to the concept of the thoracic pump. Breathing creates pressure changes in the chest that help circulate blood. Inhale, negative pressure draws blood into the heart. Exhale, blood shoots out. This is powered by the diaphragm, that umbrella-shaped muscle under the lungs.
The second heart. I love that term.
Indeed. But most adults only use about 10% of their diaphragm's range. Stoff found the emphysema patients' diaphragms had essentially broken down, barely moving. They couldn't exhale fully to get rid of CO2-rich air, so they couldn't inhale enough fresh, oxygenated air.
So Stoff's techniques were all about teaching them to exhale fully again. He'd lay them flat, gently tap rigid muscles, massage their necks, coax their ribs, have them count during long, slow exhales, waking up the diaphragm.
Counting? Like literally counting out loud?
Yeah! And Nestor describes doing this with Lynn Martin later, counting 1 to 10 over and over on the exhale, even continuing silently, mouthing the numbers when the air runs out, getting out that last little molecule. It's about training the diaphragm to move through its full range.
It sounds unorthodox, almost performative. Stoff himself admitted his methods looked silly. He'd have patients count 1 to 5 repeatedly on a single breath hold, massage throats, coax ribs.
But it worked. Patients who couldn't speak a full sentence started doing so. People started walking again. One guy even captained a boat to Florida. Before and after x-rays showed huge lung capacity increases and, crucially, more diaphragm movement.
Wait, they filmed the diaphragm moving? I thought doctors said that was impossible, that you couldn't consciously train it like that.
That was the prevailing view. Stoff used a new X-ray film technology called cinefluorography to record moving diaphragms. It stunned the doctors. They had to concede he was achieving results they thought impossible, increasing the voluntary control over this largely involuntary muscle and accessing functional lung tissue that was previously underutilized.
He wasn't reversing the lung damage, Nestor clarifies, but he was teaching patients how to use the healthy parts of their lungs much more effectively. A de facto cure.
Okay, so he helps these very sick people, and then he moves on to Olympic athletes?
Yep, Yale track team. Then athletes training for the 1968 Mexico City Olympics. He found even these elite athletes had, quote, respiratory weakness, shallow chest breathing, especially sprinters, leading to asthma, coughing, vomiting at the finish line.
He applied similar principles, teaching deep, calm breathing, emphasizing a full exhale, especially at the start of a race. Exhaling at the starter pistol, so the first inhale is full and powerful.
And it worked for them too?
Amazingly well. They recovered faster, broke personal bests. Lee Evans, who won gold, specifically credited Steph's exhale techniques. The 1968 U.S. men's track team Stuff trained won 12 medals, mostly gold, set 5 world records, and they were the only team not using supplemental oxygen.
That's incredible. So why isn't Carl Stuff a household name? Why aren't we all doing breathing coordination?
That's the frustrating part, right? Nestor suggests a few reasons. Stuff wasn't a doctor, he was a choir conductor. His methods, as Nestor experienced with Lynn Martin and saw on video, looked, well, weird. Borderline bizarre, involving lots of hands-on manipulation, tapping, jiggling, close contact counting.
He also didn't seem to systematize or easily articulate his methods. Lynn Martin said he found it, quote, too difficult to put into words. Science and medicine often struggle with integrating techniques that rely heavily on intuition, hands-on skill, and results that are hard to quantify through standard protocols, even if the outcomes are positive.
So the map he charted, as Nestor puts it, was kind of lost when he died. And current emphysema treatments don't really incorporate this focus on the diaphragm and full exhalation?
According to Nestor's research, at the time of writing, no. Treatments involved bronchodilators, steroids, oxygen, surgery, pulmonary rehab, with some basic breathing techniques, but no mention of Stuff, the second heart, or the power of a truly full exhalation he demonstrated.
Wow. It really makes you think about how much potential might be overlooked just because it doesn't fit the standard mold. You know, this focus on holistic well-being, on simple fundamental practices like breathing, having such a profound impact, reminds me of our sponsor. This episode of Penplexity is brought to you by Sharan, Sanctuary for Health and Reconnection to Animals and Nature. They're all about empowering people to achieve their highest health potential through long-term lifestyle changes, much like Stuff and Shroth were empowering people through breath. SHARAN's team of doctors and nutritionists uses scientifically backed holistic methods focused on sustainable, compassionate living.
Yeah, it's a really great fit, James. SHARAN's mission to build a, quote, culture of health resonates so much with the idea that we can actively improve our well-being, like expanding our lung capacity or learning better breathing habits. Definitely check them out.
Their focus on evidence-based, holistic lifestyle changes aligns well with the potential benefits discussed in this chapter, even if some methods, like STOS, lacked formal scientific dissemination. Exploring avenues for sustainable health is always worthwhile. You can find them at www.sharan-india.org.
That's Sharan, SHARAN-India.org. Thanks for supporting Penplexity. All right, let's open the floor. We've got time for a few questions from our listeners. First one comes from Alex in Ohio. Besides the counting exercise, are there other simple ways mentioned to improve exhalation and diaphragm use? Sarah?
Well, the chapter focuses heavily on Stuff's counting method as his core technique for training the exhale. But it builds on the idea of awareness, just paying attention to your breath, trying to consciously lengthen the exhale, feeling the diaphragm move down as you inhale and up as you exhale fully. That seems foundational. Also, the general principle of practices that stretch the lungs and keep them flexible, like the 5 Tibetan rites, or even just moderate exercise, contributes to overall lung health and capacity, which supports better breathing mechanics, including exhalation.
Makes sense. Okay, next question is from Priya in London. Ethan mentioned the Framingham study linking lung capacity to longevity. Is it definitely causal, or could lung capacity just be a marker for overall health? Ethan, your thoughts?
That's an excellent question, Priya. Correlation does not equal causation, a crucial distinction in science. While the studies showed a strong correlation, lower lung capacity associated with shorter lifespan, it's difficult to definitively isolate lung capacity as the sole cause. It's highly probable that lung capacity is also a marker for overall health. Factors like cardiovascular fitness, systemic inflammation, and general vitality influence both lung function and longevity. However, the chapter argues compellingly that actively improving lung capacity through breathing exercises and flexibility can positively impact health and potentially longevity, suggesting a causal link, even if it's intertwined with other factors. More research isolating these variables would be ideal.
Great point, Ethan. Always peeling back the layers. Final question from Ben in Sydney. Was Carl Stoff the only person exploring these ideas about breathing and exhalation, or were there others?
That's interesting. The chapter really positions Stoff as unique, especially in his work with emphysema and athletes and his specific techniques. Nestor calls him elusive, and notes his work didn't become mainstream. While ancient traditions like yoga and pranayama certainly emphasize breath control, including exhalation, Stoff's specific application and his documented results with severe respiratory patients and elite athletes seem pretty distinct in the narrative Nestor presents. Lynn Martin herself said, "Nobody since has ever been able to do what he did." So while the principles of breathwork exist elsewhere, Stoff's particular approach and documented successes seem somewhat singular according to this chapter.
Fascinating stuff. Okay, before we wrap up, who wants to give us the key takeaways from Chapter 4, Exhale?
I can summarize. First, contrary to older beliefs, lung capacity isn't fixed. It's malleable and can be increased through specific exercises and practices. Second, studies like Framingham's suggest lung capacity is a significant predictor of longevity. Third, the diaphragm plays a crucial, often underutilized role in breathing efficiency and circulation, the second heart. Fourth, Carl Stoff's work highlighted the critical importance of a full exhalation for improving lung function, athletic performance, and managing conditions like emphysema, using techniques like guided counting to train the diaphragm. Finally, sometimes effective methods might exist outside mainstream medicine, even if they appear unorthodox.
Perfectly put, Ethan. A lot to breathe in and out. There. So, listeners, what rabbit hole should Penplexity dive down next? Let us know. You can find us on all the socials at Penplexity or visit our website, penplexity.com. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, keep reading, keep questioning, and maybe keep exhaling fully. Bye for now.
Bye, everyone. Breathe easy.
Farewell.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to Penplexity, the podcast where we get perplexed by the written word, but in a good way, mostly. I'm your host, James, and as always, I'm joined by the ever-insightful Sarah and our resident brainiac, Ethan.
Hey. Excited to be back.
Greetings, fellow perplexers. Ready to unravel some text?
Awesome. So today we're diving head first, or maybe nose first, into Chapter 5 of James Nestor's Breath. This chapter is simply titled Slow. And let me tell you, it slows things right down, but in a really, really mind-bending way.
Oh, totally. This is where Nestor and his breathing guru partner, Anders Olsen, are in the recovery phase after that insane mouth-taping experiment. And even though they feel transformed breathing through their noses again, Olsen is laser-focused on his big obsession, carbon dioxide.
Right, CO2, which honestly, reading this, my first reaction was kind of like Nestor's. Isn't that bad? Like pollution, waste product, get it out of your system bad?
Exactly. That's the common thinking. Your boxing instructor yelling to breathe deep and get all that carbon dioxide out? Olsen basically says that's the worst advice. He drops this bombshell early on, telling Nestor, "I really think carbon dioxide is more important than oxygen."
Which sounds counterintuitive, dramatically so. We associate oxygen with life, carbon dioxide with, well, suffocation and climate change. But Olsen's point, biochemically speaking, isn't entirely unfounded. We do have vastly more CO2 molecules in our bodies than O2 at any given moment, primarily bound up or dissolved in blood plasma.
Yeah, Olsen argues we actually need more CO2, not less. He even says it was huge amounts of CO2, along with oxygen, that fueled the Cambrian explosion way back when. And that increasing it now can sharpen our minds, help burn fat. It sounds wild.
Okay, hang on. Burn fat? How does CO2 tie into weight loss? That seems like a leap.
Right? But get this. Nestor points out something mind-blowing that most people, even doctors sometimes, get wrong. When you lose fat, where does it go? You don't just sweat it all out. For every 10 pounds of fat lost, 8.5 pounds comes out through your lungs as carbon dioxide mixed with water vapor. Your lungs are literally a weight-regulating system.
Its basic mass balance. Fat is primarily composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms. When metabolized for energy, the carbon and oxygen atoms combine to form CO2, which is then expelled via respiration. The hydrogen combines with oxygen to form water, which is excreted in various ways. So yes, the majority of the mass leaves as CO2.
My mind is slightly blown. So breathing isn't just about getting oxygen in. It's about getting the remnants of fat out as CO2? Okay. But how does more CO2 help us?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And it goes back over a century to a Danish physiologist, Christian Bohr.
Ah yes, the Bohr effect, a cornerstone of respiratory physiology. Bohr figured out why oxygen gets released from hemoglobin, those little protein guest rooms on the red blood cell cruise ships. Nestor describes precisely where it's needed, like in working muscles.
Exactly. It turns out higher concentrations of carbon dioxide, which tissues produce when they're working hard, make the blood slightly more acidic. This acidity acts like a key, unlocking the oxygen from hemoglobin, letting it jump off the cruise ship and fuel the cells.
It's an elegant feedback loop. More metabolic activity leads to more CO2, which facilitates greater oxygen release precisely in those active tissues. Conversely, if you breathe too heavily and blow off too much CO2, the hemoglobin holds onto oxygen more tightly. The key isn't turning as effectively. This is known as the Haldane effect's counterpart.
So, breathing too much, too fast, like hyperventilating, actually reduces oxygen delivery to your tissues, even though you're taking in more air?
Bingo! That's what Olson was getting at. And another researcher, Yandel Henderson at Yale, took this even further. He was convinced CO2 was vital, calling it, quote, the chief hormone of the entire body.
Henderson's work was significant, though his methods involving experiments on dogs were certainly products of a different era and ethically problematic by today's standards. He demonstrated that forcefully overventilating the animals, purging their CO2, led to catastrophic physiological failure, even death despite abundant oxygen. Conversely, slowing their breathing down restored normal function.
Yikes. Okay, focusing on the findings. He showed that too much breathing is literally harmful, starving tissues of oxygen, because the CO2 isn't there to help release it, and that even mild overbreathing could cause anxiety and confusion.
Yes, like altitude sickness or panic attacks. And the cure wasn't drugs primarily, but simply restoring normal CO2 levels by breathing slowly, letting the body regulate itself.
Which brings us back to Nestor and Olson, sitting at the dining table, covered in wires, breathing slowly.
Totally. They hook Olson up to measure everything: heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen, and importantly, exhaled CO2. He starts breathing super slowly, like 6 breaths a minute, instead of the typical 15 to 18.
A significant reduction in respiratory rate.
And what happens? His CO2 levels climb by 25%, moving him into a healthy range. His blood pressure drops, heart rate slows down into the 60s. But his oxygen saturation? Rock solid at 97%. It doesn't budge.
Wait, breathing less didn't make his oxygen drop? How does that work?
It relates to the efficiency of gas exchange and oxygen uptake. At a normal breathing rate, you're only absorbing about a quarter of the oxygen you inhale. The rest is exhaled. By breathing more slowly and deeply, you give the lungs more time to extract oxygen from each breath. The body is remarkably good at maintaining oxygen saturation within a normal physiological range, unless severely compromised.
Yeah, Nestor compares it to rowing a boat. Lots of short, frantic strokes versus fewer, longer, more powerful ones. The slow breaths are just way more efficient. They even saw this on the stationary bike.
Oh, right. The bike experiments. Tell us about that.
Okay, so first, breathing only through their noses, they naturally started performing better than their previous mouth-breathing attempts. But then Nestor tried consciously breathing really slowly while pedaling hard, down to 6 breaths a minute. He felt that awful air hunger, totally claustrophobic. Sure, he was starving his body.
Which sounds terrifying during exercise.
Totally. But he checks the pulse oximeter, and his oxygen levels hadn't dropped. They'd actually risen slightly. Slower breathing, even during exertion, led to better oxygenation.
It underscores the principle that perceived air hunger isn't always directly correlated with blood oxygen saturation. It's often driven by the buildup of CO2, which triggers the urge to breathe. Learning to tolerate that sensation allows for more efficient, slower respiration.
Wow. Okay, this is fundamentally changing how I think about taking a deep breath. It's not about grabbing more air, necessarily, but breathing better, slower. This feels like something we should all know. Speaking of things we should all know about, improving our well-being, that connects really well to our sponsor for this episode, Sharan, Sanctuary for Health and Reconnection to Animals and Nature.
Oh, that's a perfect fit.
Right, Sharan is all about spreading awareness of holistic health and sustainable, compassionate living. They've got a whole team. Doctors, nutritionists, health coaches, focused on empowering people to make long-term lifestyle changes for vibrant health. It really resonates with this chapter's idea that something as fundamental as breathing, a lifestyle change we can all make, can have profound effects.
Absolutely. Their approach is based on scientific evidence, helping people reach their highest health potential. And just like learning to breathe slowly takes practice, Sharan supports people in making those sustainable shifts. They've helped over 100,000 people worldwide. Definitely check them out.
Indeed, their mission aligns well with the underlying theme here, that optimizing fundamental physiological processes, informed by science, can lead to significant improvements in health and well-being. You can find more info and resources on their website, www.sharon-india.org.
That's www.sharon-india.org. Huge thanks to Sharan for supporting Penplexity. All right, before we wrap up this deep dive into slow breathing and the wonders of CO2, let's take a few questions from our listeners. First question is from Breathless Brian in Boston. He asks, is there an ideal slow breathing rate? The chapter mentions 6 breaths per minute, but also 5.5.
That's an excellent question. The chapter highlights research by Gerbarg and Brown in New York, who identified what they term resonant or coherent breathing. They found peak efficiency, where heart rate variability, respiratory, and circulatory systems synchronize optimally, occurs around 5.5 breaths per minute. That translates to a 5.5-second inhale and a 5.5-second exhale.
Yeah, but Nestor also points out, it doesn't have to be exact. Whether it's 6 seconds or 5, as long as it's in that slow range, around 5 to 6 breaths per minute, you get the benefits. The key is slowing down from our usual, often faster rate.
Okay, cool. So aim for around 5.5 to 6, but don't stress about perfection. Got it. Next question from Prayerful Patty in Peoria. The connection to prayer was fascinating. Is the book suggesting prayer only works because of the breathing rate?
Ooh, good one. The chapter points out this amazing coincidence. Catholic rosary recitations, Buddhist chants like Om Mani Padme Hum, Kundalini yoga chants, even ancient Hindu techniques like Kechari Mudra, they all naturally lead to breathing around that 5.5 to 6 breaths per minute rhythm.
The researchers in Pavia, Italy, who studied the rosary and mantras, suggested that this synchronized breathing induces physiological coherence, increased blood flow to the brain, balanced nervous system, which creates a feeling of well-being. They hypothesized this might make individuals more responsive to the religious message. It doesn't negate the spiritual or psychological aspects of prayer, but highlights a powerful physiological component that likely contributes to its calming and potentially healing effects.
So, the slow breathing is a key part of why prayer feels calming and perhaps healing, but not necessarily the only reason. Makes sense. Okay, last question from Colorado 2, Curious Chris. If higher CO2 is good, should I, try to hold my breath more or breathe into a paper bag?
Whoa there, Chris. Definitely not. It's not about drastically increasing CO2 to dangerous levels. It's about restoring a natural balance by breathing slowly and through the nose. The slow, gentle breaths naturally allow CO2 to build up to optimal physiological levels, which then helps oxygen delivery.
Precisely. Practices like extreme breath holding or rebreathing air from a bag can dangerously alter blood gases. The chapter advocates for gentle, rhythmic, slow breathing, specifically around that 5.5 to 6 breaths per minute, not forceful manipulation of CO2 levels. It's about efficiency and balance, not excess.
Excellent clarification. Don't go experimenting with paper bags, folks. Slow nasal breathing is the key. All right, that was great. Before we sign off, Sarah, could you maybe give us the key takeaways from Chapter 5?
Sure thing. Okay, number 1, slow down. Breathing slowly, around 5.5 to 6 breaths per minute, is incredibly beneficial. Number 2. Carbon dioxide isn't the enemy we think it is. We need sufficient CO2 levels for oxygen to be released effectively into our tissues. That's the Bohr effect. Number 3. Overbreathing, or breathing too fast and shallow, actually reduces oxygen delivery and can stress the body. Number 4. Slow, nasal breathing can improve physical performance and endurance, even if it feels counterintuitive at first. And finally, number 5. This slow breathing rhythm seems to be universally embedded in ancient prayer and chanting practices across many cultures, suggesting humans have known about its calming, centering benefits for millennia.
Perfect summary, Sarah. Slow down, appreciate CO2, and maybe find your resonant rhythm. So much to think about, and practice. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Ethan.
A pleasure as always.
Anytime.
That's all for this episode of Penplexity. What book or chapter has you perplexed? Let us know what we should tackle next. Find us on social media at Penplexity or visit our website, penplexity.com. Until next time, keep reading, keep breathing, slowly. Bye now. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Penplexity, the podcast where we unravel the fascinating tangles found in books. I'm your host, James, and today we're diving into Chapter 6 of James Nestor's Breath. It's simply titled, Less. Seems straightforward, right? Well, buckle up. And joining me to unpack this, we have our brilliant regulars. First up, the ever insightful and fun Sarah. How are you doing, Sarah?
Hey James, doing great, ready to talk about, well, not breathing so much. It sounds kind of counterintuitive, but this chapter is fascinating. Really fascinating.
Exactly. And back with his signature blend of wit and wisdom, it's our resident scientist, Ethan. Ethan, good to have you.
Pleasure to be here, James. Ready to dissect the science behind restraint, specifically respiratory restraint, which, as Sarah notes, feels odd in a world telling us to take deep breaths.
Right? So Sarah, kick us off. What's the big, lesser picture Nestor paints in this chapter?
Okay, so the core idea is pretty stark. Nestor draws this parallel between overeating and overbreathing. He points out how American BMI has shot up dramatically since the mid-1800s. We know we eat too much. But then he says, we've also become a culture of overbreathers.
Overbreathers? Is that even a thing? Like, isn't more air better?
That's the common assumption. But Nestor argues, based on talking to pulmonauts and looking at available studies, which he admits are fewer and maybe less consistent than diet studies, that modern normal breathing is like 12 to 20 breaths a minute. He suggests this might be twice as much as it historically was.
And crucially, it's not just the rate, but the volume. He quotes an average intake of about half a liter per breath. So even if you slow your breathing down, you could still be gulping way too much air overall. The key distinction he makes is that breathing less isn't necessarily the same as breathing slowly.
Okay, hang on. So less breaths and less air per breath? That sounds suffocating?
It does sound that way, but think about it historically. Nestor mentions Indian yogis training to decrease air intake at rest. Tibetan Buddhist monks had specific practices to reduce breathing. Ancient Chinese doctors apparently recommended about 9.5 breaths per minute. And that cool story about Japanese samurai testing soldiers with a feather under the nose. If it moved, they failed.
These historical anecdotes suggest a long-standing awareness across different cultures that calmer, shallower breathing might be optimal for certain states, whether it's readiness, health, or spiritual practice. It counters our modern more is more approach.
Nestor himself experienced this during that Stanford experiment, right? With the nose plugs and then switching back?
Yeah, in the lead-up to this chapter, he mentions that by slowing his breathing rate, even just slowing it, his blood pressure dropped, heart rate variability went up, more energy, but his guide, Anders Olsen, kept pushing him to go further, to breathe way less, like the respiratory equivalent of fasting.
Which Olsen clearly believed had potent benefits, sometimes even leading to euphoria, though Nestor rightly includes the caveat that chronic air starvation is injurious. This breathing way less is positioned as an occasional potent practice, akin to fasting, not a permanent state.
Olson had that wild story about seeing God after a run, right? That intense peace and unity from breathing less?
He did. It sounds pretty out there, but it led to this jogging experiment Nestor did with him in Golden Gate Park, which, as someone who also kinda hates jogging, I related to James's description of the misery and boredom.
Ha! Totally. So what was this less breathing jogging thing they did?
Okay, so Olson's technique was about extending the exhales while keeping inhales short. Like inhale for 3 seconds, exhale for 4, then 5, 6, 7 seconds as the run progresses. The idea is to build up carbon dioxide tolerance.
And that's the crucial scientific point. Higher CO2 tolerance doesn't suffocate you. It actually allows for better oxygen release to your tissues, the Bohr effect, essentially. This increases your aerobic endurance, your VO2 max. So training to breathe less, paradoxically, improves your cardiorespiratory fitness and potentially longevity.
Okay, that Bohr effect thing makes sense, theoretically. But building CO2 sounds unpleasant. Did Nestor enjoy this run?
He describes it as challenging, feeling like he's being mildly strangled, veins bulging, sweating. Olson's pushing him even slower, even less. Nestor almost pukes at one point. It's definitely not portrayed as a walk in the park. Well, it was a walk in the park, but you know what I mean.
Right. So who's the godfather of this less is more breathing? Nestor introduces someone.
Ah, yes, Konstantin Pavlovich Buteyko, a Ukrainian-born Soviet medical doctor. Fascinating backstory. Former mechanic in World War II, saw the body as a complex machine. He suffered from severe hypertension himself.
And he had this epiphany, noticing that the sickest patients, especially those with hypertension like him, breathed really heavily. He tried consciously breathing less, sipping air through his nose, relaxing his chest, and his own pain vanished. He brought it back by breathing heavily again. That led to his big question. What if overbreathing wasn't a symptom, but the cause of things like hypertension?
A radical idea at the time. He linked overbreathing to disturbances in circulation, blood pH, metabolism. He theorized that breathing even 10 to 20% more than needed could chronically overwork bodily systems, leading to weakness and disease. He even tried his technique on an asthma patient mid-attack, and apparently it worked.
Wow, so he took this idea and ran with it? To Siberia, no less?
Yeah, to Akademgorodok, the secret Soviet science city. He set up a massive lab with over 200 researchers, hooking up subjects to machines, measuring everything. His findings reinforced his theory. Sick patients, asthma, hypertension, breathed too much, often through the mouth, maybe 15 plus liters a minute, with lower CO2 levels. Healthy patients breathed less, around 5 to 6 liters a minute total, about 10 breaths per minute, with higher CO2.
Based on this, he developed his protocol, later called Voluntary Elimination of Deep Breathing, or VEDB. The goal wasn't a specific breath rate, but achieving that optimal volume, around 6 liters per minute at rest, by training people to breathe less, matching intake to metabolic need.
And people felt better?
Reportedly, yes. Tingling, heat in extremities, slower heart rates, reduced hypertension, migraines disappearing. Even healthy people and athletes reported improvements.
Okay, speaking of athletes, Nestor brings up that Czech runner, Emil Zatopek.
Oh yeah, Zatopek, the Czech locomotive. He apparently developed his own breath restriction technique totally independently. He'd run super fast while holding his breath, gasp a bit, then repeat. It looked agonizing. Nestor mentions his trademark anguished face, but the guy won 3 gold medals in 1 Olympics, including the marathon, which he'd never run before. 18 world records.
They called it hypoventilation training, hypo meaning under, the opposite of hyperventilation. Despite Zatopek's success, it didn't really catch on initially, probably because it looked so painful. But then, decades later,
U.S. swim coach James Nestor rediscovered it. He had his swimmers hold their breath for way more strokes, like up to 9. His team absolutely dominated the 1976 Montreal Olympics. It was like Buteyko and Zatopek, but underwater.
But didn't studies later say it was just placebo?
some did, in the 80s and 90s. But then Dr. Xavier Warrons, a French physiologist, identified a flaw. Those studies often tested athletes holding their breath with full lungs. Warrons tested it with half-full lungs. closer to Buteyko's and likely Councilman's method. And that showed huge benefits: better lactate tolerance, increased red blood cells, essentially mimicking high-altitude training benefits at sea level. It boosts performance, helps you do more with less.
Which brings us back to Nestor's run. Did he reach that Zatopek agony or Olsen euphoria?
Not quite euphoria, but something happened. Towards the end, he describes intense heat in his neck, pixelated vision, like jumping into warm liquid. Heat spreading to his fingers and toes. It felt great, he says. He describes it as that, quote, good headache, Olsen mentioned.
Which is likely the physiological response. Increased CO2 dilating blood vessels, improving oxygen delivery to tissues. The vessels in the brain engorge with blood, sending those dull pain or heat signals. It's the body adapting.
Okay, but he also says that extreme training is probably only for people willing to suffer. Which, yeah, but Buteyko wasn't about creating Olympians, was he?
Exactly. Nestor emphasizes Buteyko wanted to heal people, save lives. He faced a lot of pushback, censure, even physical attacks. But he persisted. By the 80s, his methods were recognized by the Soviet Ministry of Health. He supposedly even helped Prince Charles with allergies.
His biggest impact, arguably, was on respiratory diseases, especially asthma, which is incredibly relevant today, given the massive rise in asthma rates, a fourfold increase since 1980 in the US alone.
And asthma is often triggered by overbreathing, right? Like exercise-induced asthma?
Yeah, Nestor points out asthmatics tend to breathe more anyway. During an attack, it gets worse. Air gets trapped, airways constrict, they feel breathless, panic, breathe more. It's a vicious cycle. Buteyko saw the wheezing and constriction as the body's reflex to try and force less breathing.
Which is another perspective shift. Is the symptom the problem, or a misguided attempt at a solution by the body?
Nestor shares some powerful stories about people using Buteyko-style methods for asthma.
Totally. David Wiebe, the instrument maker, severe asthma since childhood, tons of meds, facing blindness from steroid side effects. Within months of breathing less, he was off steroids, barely using an inhaler. His own pulmonologist confirmed the improvement. There are others, too. A university CIO, a 70-year-old woman who went from struggling to walk to hiking for hours, athletes, all reporting huge benefits.
And there's solid research, too. Dr. Alicia Murray's study used capnometers, devices measuring CO2 in exhaled breath. Asthmatics practiced breathing less to keep CO2 at a healthy 5.5%. After a month, 80% had raised their CO2, had fewer attacks, better lung function. Murray called hyperventilation a, quote, biological system error that breathing less seems to correct.
Okay, let's pause here for a moment, because this idea of correcting our body systems through natural means really resonates with our sponsor today. We're thrilled to be supported by Sharan, the sanctuary for health and reconnection to animals and nature. Sharan is all about empowering people to achieve their highest health potential through long-term lifestyle changes, focusing on holistic health and sustainable, compassionate living. Just like this chapter highlights how a fundamental thing, like breathing, impacts everything, Sharan looks at the whole picture of well-being.
Absolutely, James. SHARAN's approach, using scientifically backed methods from doctors and nutritionists to foster real change, feels so aligned with the kind of deep, systemic shifts Nestor is talking about in Breath. It's not just about quick fixes, but about building a true culture of health. Really impressive work.
Indeed. Their focus on empowering individuals with knowledge and tools for lasting change is commendable. If you're interested in holistic health, plant-based nutrition, and sustainable living, definitely check out their resources and programs. Visit www.sharan-india.org to learn more.
Thanks, guys. That's sharanindia.org. Definitely worth a look. Okay, back to Buteyko and the why. Ethan, you mentioned blood pH?
Right. Dr. Ira Packman, an internist who used breathing less for his own asthma, explained it well. Overbreathing expels too much CO2, making blood more alkaline. The body wants to stay at a pH of 7.4, so the kidneys compensate by releasing bicarbonate, an alkaline compound, into urine. This brings pH back down, but
it's a temporary fix. Done constantly for years. This buffering depletes essential minerals like magnesium, potassium, phosphorus, because they leave the body with the bicarbonate. And without those minerals, nerves, muscles, energy production. Nothing works right. It can even weaken bones as they release minerals to compensate. You can literally overbreathe your way towards osteoporosis.
That's wild. So fixing the breathing helps restore that balance?
That's the theory Pachman puts forward. Replace the deficient element, in this case, normalizing CO2 levels through breathing less, and the patient gets better. He acknowledges it's not always a CO2 deficiency issue, like an emphysema where CO2 can be too high, but argues that almost everyone with these chronic issues has a fundamental breathing problem that less paced breathing techniques can address.
And Nestor ties this all together beautifully at the end, connecting slow breathing to longevity. Mammals with the slowest heart rates live the longest, and they also tend to breathe the slowest. Think whales versus, well, smaller, faster-breathing mammals.
So it all comes down to the perfect breath?
Pretty much. After exploring all these different paths, yogis, buteyko, athletes, scientists, Nestor lands on this number, 5.5. About 5.5 liters of air per minute, achieved through about 5.5 breaths per minute. That means a 5.5-second inhale and a 5.5-second exhale. That's presented as the sweet spot, the quote, perfect breath for optimal function.
A rate and volume that balances oxygen intake with CO2 retention, promoting efficient energy use and system balance. Practicing this, even for a few minutes a day, can offer benefits.
Wow. Okay, my mind is officially blown, and I'm suddenly very conscious of my own breathing. Let's take a few questions from our listeners. First one is from Alex in Ohio. Is trying to breathe less like this safe for everyone? What if someone has a pre-existing condition, Ethan?
That's an excellent and crucial question. While the general principle of avoiding chronic overbreathing is beneficial, drastic changes or extreme techniques like hypoventilation training shouldn't be undertaken lightly, especially without guidance. Buteyko himself tailored techniques. Nestor notes Olson's warning about potential dangers of extreme air restriction. Conditions like emphysema involve CO2 retention, so the approach needs nuance. Consulting a knowledgeable practitioner or doctor, particularly if you have respiratory or cardiovascular issues, is always the wisest course before attempting significant changes or intense practices.
Good advice. Okay, next question is from Maya in London. How quickly can someone expect to see benefits, especially for something like mild asthma or just feeling calmer, Sarah?
Great question. Based on the anecdotes and studies Nestor cites, it varies, but some effects can be quite rapid. Buteyko noticed changes in himself and the asthma patient within minutes. Nestor felt benefits from slower breathing within days during the Stanford experiment. For asthma, stories like David Weeby's show significant improvement over weeks or months of consistent practice. Dr. Murray's study showed results in 4 weeks. So while deep changes take time and consistency, some initial shifts towards calmness or slightly easier breathing might be noticeable relatively quickly, with dedicated practice of gentle, slower, less breathing.
Makes sense. And one more from Ben in Sydney. The chapter talks a lot about breathing while awake or exercising. What about overbreathing during sleep? Is that a factor?
That's a very pertinent point, though this specific chapter focuses more on conscious breathing and exertion. However, the underlying principle of chronic overbreathing certainly extends to sleep. Many people mouth breathe or breathe erratically during sleep, which can disrupt sleep quality and contribute to the same systemic issues discussed: poor gas exchange, potential pH shifts. Other parts of Nestor's book delve more into nasal breathing and its importance, which is highly relevant for sleep quality. So yes, dysfunctional breathing patterns during sleep are definitely a factor in overall respiratory health, even if this chapter's main focus is elsewhere.
Fascinating stuff. All right, before we wrap up, Sarah, can you give us the key takeaways from Chapter 6? Less.
Sure thing. I'd say there are 3 big ones. First, just like we tend to overeat, many of us chronically overbreathe, taking in too much air too often, which can stress our bodies. Second, the solution is to consciously practice breathing less, both fewer breaths per minute and smaller volumes, aiming for better carbon dioxide balance, which actually improves oxygen delivery and endurance. Third, this principle, explored by figures like Buteyko, Zatopek, and validated by modern science, has profound benefits, especially for respiratory conditions like asthma, potentially by correcting physiological imbalances related to blood pH and mineral levels. And finally, the perfect breath seems to hover around 5.5 seconds in, 5.5 seconds out.
Excellent summary, Sarah. Thank you both, Sarah and Ethan, for another fantastic discussion.
Always a pleasure, James.
Likewise.
So, what did you all think? Has this chapter made you rethink how you breathe? Let us know. And tell us what book or chapter you think Penplexity should tackle next. Find us on all the socials at Penplexity, that's Penplexity. And check out our website, penplexity.com, for past episodes and more. Until next time, keep reading, keep thinking, and maybe breathe a little less. Thanks for listening. Hello and welcome back to Penplexity, the podcast where we get, well, perplexed by books. I'm your host, James, and today we're diving headfirst, maybe mouth first, into Chapter 7 of James Nestor's Breath. It's called Chew. And joining me to unpack this chewy chapter, we have the always insightful and effervescent Sarah.
Hey, James. So ready to get into this one. It's fascinatingly weird.
And rounding out our trio, the man who brings the science with a side of wit, Ethan.
Greetings. Prepared to masticate on the data presented herein.
Ha! Love it. Okay, so Chapter 7 kicks off right at the end of that intense Stanford experiment from the previous chapter. Nestor and Olson just spent 10 days breathing only through their mouths, and then 10 days breathing only through their noses. Sarah, catch us up. How were they feeling after switching back to nasal breathing?
Oh, it was like night and day, James. They felt so much better almost immediately. Remember how awful they felt mouth breathing? Like sluggish high blood pressure, terrible sleep apnea, snoring like crazy?
Yeah, it sounded miserable.
Well, switching back to nasal breathing reversed a ton of that, super fast. Nestor mentions his snoring dropped by something like 4,000%?
A statistically significant, albeit perhaps hyperbolically expressed, improvement.
Totally. Their sleep apnea vanished, blood pressure dropped, Nestor's went down 10 points on average, even 20 points from its peak. Their CO2 levels were getting better, nudging towards that, quote, super endurance Mark Buteyko talked about. And all they did was breathe through their noses, slower, less, with full exhales.
Just breathing right? It sounds so simple, but clearly so powerful. Then Nestor has this moment, his last supper of the experiment, eating pasta, and he mentions that the act of chewing, just chewing, was the catalyst for writing the whole book. How does chewing link to all this breathing stuff?
Right? It seems random, but it's the key to this whole chapter, and maybe the book. He connects it back to why our faces and airways got so messed up in the first place. We talked before about cooking making food softer, but this chapter argues the really dramatic changes happened much later and faster.
The hypothesis posits a significant morphological shift coinciding with major dietary changes in human history, specifically the advent of agriculture and, more dramatically, the Industrial Revolution.
Exactly. Nestor points out that around 12,000 years ago, with the first farming cultures, we see the first widespread instances of crooked teeth and deformed mouths. But it wasn't everywhere, kinda random.
Okay, so farming started it. But then what happened?
Then boom! About 300 years ago, with the Industrial Revolution, things went haywire. Processed foods became the norm. Milled flour, refined sugar, canned goods, everything got soft, mushy.
This reduction in dietary toughness decreased the need for vigorous mastication. The theory is that this lack of mechanical stress during crucial developmental periods led to insufficient growth of the jaws and facial bones.
Yeah, our faces literally started shrinking, growing flatter, mouths got smaller, teeth got crowded, sinuses plugged. Nestor says these changes were way bigger than the earlier evolutionary ones, like the larynx lowering. We became, like, the worst breathers in the animal kingdom.
The worst breathers? That's quite a title. And he says this research wasn't really happening in medicine, but in anthropology? With skulls?
You got it. He wanted to see the patient zeros of the modern obstructed human mouth, so he ends up, sneaking into the Paris catacombs.
Wait, what? Like the tourist place?
Nope. The other 99%. The illegal off-limits part with miles of tunnels filled with bones. He went with these guides, these quote codophiles, looking for a specific ossuary.
A rather unorthodox method for accessing skeletal remains. One hopes appropriate ethical considerations, or perhaps just the statute of limitations, were factored in.
Seriously. So what did he find down there, among 6 million skeletons?
He found this hidden ossuary with victims of an 1832 cholera epidemic. This was right smack in the middle of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, when processed foods were common.
And the skulls?
He said they looked different from the ancient hunter-gatherer skulls he'd seen pictures of. These skulls seemed lopsided, arches were V-shaped, faces looked short and stunted. They were city dwellers, likely eating those soft, processed industrial foods. He saw them as evidence of how our faces changed.
Wow. Okay, so soft food, less chewing, smaller faces, crooked teeth, bad breathing. It seems connected. Did anyone else figure this out?
Oh yeah. People suspected it for ages. Some thought it was vitamin D deficiency, others vitamin C. Then came Weston Price in the 1930s.
I've heard that name. The dentist guy?
That's him. He traveled the world comparing indigenous groups still eating traditional diets to those who had switched to modern processed foods, white flour, sugar, canned stuff.
Price's work, while extensive in observation, has faced criticism for methodological limitations, such as small sample sizes and potentially anecdotal interpretations. However, his core observation of a stark difference in dental health and facial structure between populations on traditional versus industrialized diets is noteworthy.
Right, Ethan. And what Price found, consistently, was that groups eating traditional diets, wildly different diets, mind you, some all meat, some vegetarian, some dairy, some no dairy, had amazing teeth, wide jaws, broad nasal passages, almost no cavities or breathing issues like asthma.
So it wasn't one specific diet, but something they all had in common?
They all had way higher amounts of vitamins and minerals, yes. Price thought the lack of these nutrients caused the problems. But Nestor argues Price was only half right.
Indeed, while nutritional deficiencies undoubtedly impact bone development and overall health, the mechanical stimulation provided by chewing appears to be a critical factor often overlooked.
Exactly. It was the chewing itself, or the lack of it. Our ancestors chewed for hours a day on tough stuff. Modern processed food requires almost no chewing. That constant stress was missing.
So even if we took supplements, our faces might still shrink without that chewing workout.
That's the argument. The mechanical load stimulates bone remodeling and growth, particularly in the maxilla and mandible during development, but potentially even later in life, as Balfour suggests.
Okay, so our faces are potentially too small. Airways clogged. What can we do about it? Nestor talks about modern fixes, right?
He does. He starts with Dr. Nyack, the Stanford surgeon. They talk about the Drano approach first. Saline rinses, steroid sprays for minor congestion. Then maybe balloon sinuplasty to open sinuses.
Minimally invasive procedures aimed at improving airflow.
Right, and then there's surgery for deviated septums or swollen turbinates, which are super common. Nyack says most surgeries are successful.
But
there's a risk. If surgeons remove too much tissue, especially turbinates, it can lead to something called empty nose syndrome.
that sounds bad.
It sounds horrific. Nestor interviewed people who felt like they were suffocating on air, constant pain, couldn't sleep. It really spooked him off rushing into surgery.
A devastating iatrogenic condition resulting from overly aggressive surgical intervention disrupting the nose's ability to properly condition and sense airflow.
Yikes. Okay, so surgery has risks. What about non-surgical stuff? Dentists?
Yeah, he talks to dentists specializing in airway issues. They look for signs like a low-hanging uvula, a tongue with teeth marks on the side showing it's too big for the mouth, thick necks, all potential signs of obstruction.
Makes sense.
He mentions Dr. Michael Gelb, who sees patients who are tired, anxious, maybe misdiagnosed, but don't always have full-blown sleep apnea on tests. They might use CPAP, which helps many, but it doesn't fix the root cause.
Which is often proposed to be the inadequate size of the oral cavity itself.
Exactly. A mouth that's too small for the face.
Which brings us to orthodontics and braces. I had those.
Me too. And this part is wild. Nestor explains that the earliest orthodontic devices, like from the 1800s and early 1900s, weren't just for straight teeth. They were designed to expand the mouth, widen the palate, like Pierre Robin's monoblock.
Widen? But my orthodontist pulled teeth out.
That's the shift that happened. Around the 1940s, especially in the US, it became standard practice to extract teeth and use braces and headgear to pull the remaining teeth back. It made things easier to manage, maybe, but
It potentially exacerbated the underlying issue by further reducing the intraoral volume.
yeah, making a too small mouth even smaller. And some people started developing breathing problems after this kind of orthodontics. Snoring, apnea, jaw clicking, faces looking flatter.
Whoa. Did anyone notice this?
Dr. John Mew did, back in the 50s. A British dentist. He compared kids who had extractions and retractive braces versus those who had expansion. He found the extraction kids often had stunted facial growth and more airway obstruction.
Mew's theories, often termed orthotropics, focused on guiding facial growth forward, counter to the retractive methods. He faced significant opposition from the established dental community.
Sounds like a familiar story in this book. Was he just dismissed?
For a long time, yeah, he was called a quack, lost his license eventually. But recently, Nestor notes, more orthodontists and even a Stanford University press book are supporting his ideas, saying traditional orthodontics could worsen breathing in some cases.
Okay, so before we get into fixing this, let's talk about our sponsor. This chapter is all about how lifestyle changes, like, our diet hundreds of years ago, impacted our physical structure and health, specifically our breathing. It really makes you think about the fundamentals of well-being.
It totally does, which actually connects really well to our sponsor, Sharan.
Exactly. Sharan, that's the Sanctuary for Health and Reconnection to Animals and Nature, is all about empowering people to achieve their highest health potential through long-term lifestyle changes. They focus on holistic health using scientifically backed, doctor-tested methods.
Yeah, it's about building a culture of health, looking at things like nutrition and sustainable living. Considering how this chapter links processed food to breathing issues, SHARAN's focus on whole food, plant-based nutrition feels super relevant. Check them out at www.sharan-india.org.
Their emphasis on evidence-based lifestyle interventions aligns with the principle that proactive, holistic approaches can significantly impact long-term health outcomes, potentially mitigating issues like those discussed in Nestor's work. It's worth investigating their resources.
Definitely. Find them at www.sharan-india.org. Okay, back to fixing our potentially shrunken faces. Mew had ideas, right? Something called mewing?
Ha! Yes, mewing. It sounds funny, but it's basically about maintaining correct oral posture. Lips together, teeth lightly touching, and importantly, tongue resting on the roof of your mouth.
My tongue is definitely not always there.
Mine neither, consciously. But the idea is that improper posture, head forward, S-shaped spine, tongue falling back, contributes to airway obstruction. Mewing, along with tongue exercises, is supposed to help retrain that posture, maybe even help expand the palate over time by directing the tongue's force upwards.
The concept relates to orofacial myofunctional therapy, which aims to correct dysfunctional muscle patterns in the mouth and face. The purported extent of skeletal remodeling in adults via mewing alone remains a subject of debate and lacks robust, large-scale studies. But the focus on proper oral rest posture is generally well accepted.
Nestor tried it, right? Said it felt like holding back vomit?
He did. It takes practice. But the underlying principle is using the tongue's force constructively.
Okay, and then there's Dr. Belfour and his device?
Right, Dr. Theodore Belfour, another dentist challenging conventional wisdom. He believes we can grow bone in our faces, even as adults.
Specifically, he focuses on the maxilla, the upper jaw, which is made of membrane bone, suggesting it retains plasticity longer than other bones. His theory involves stimulating stem cells in the cranial sutures via mechanical forces, primarily chewing.
Yeah, he argues that chewing is key, that clamping down, especially on the back molars with the powerful masseter muscle, signals stem cells to build bone density.
So chewing literally builds your face?
That's the idea. It links back to breastfeeding, too. The effort involved helps develop facial muscles and bones. Belfour invented a device called the homeoblock.
Like the old monoblock?
Similar idea. It's a retainer-like device worn at night. It's designed to gently expand the palate and stimulate that chewing pressure, encouraging bone growth and opening the airway without needing to gnaw and bark for hours.
And Nestor used it?
He did, for a year, and the results he shares are kinda stunning.
Tell me.
He got rescanned, and the analysis showed he'd grown new bone in his face. Like the equivalent volume of 5 pennies in his cheeks and eye socket, plus bone along his nose and upper jaw. His airways widened, his jaw alignment improved, and some sinus gunk cleared up.
Quantitative evidence of morphological change in an adult subject following appliance use. While a single case study, it provides intriguing support for Belfour's hypothesis regarding adult maxillary plasticity.
That is genuinely wild. Growing bone as an adult just by wearing a retainer and chewing, essentially. So the takeaway is that our faces aren't fixed?
That seems to be the message. That we can potentially reverse some of the damage caused by centuries of soft food through conscious effort, posture, chewing, maybe devices like the homeoblock. And Nestor himself felt he was breathing better than ever.
Incredible. Okay, let's take a few questions from our listeners. First one, can mewing really change my face shape as an adult? Ethan, what do you think?
The potential for significant skeletal change in adults solely through mewing exercises is likely limited compared to changes possible during growth phases. Bone is less plastic. However, consistent correct oral posture can influence soft tissues and potentially prevent further negative changes. It may also improve airway function subtly. Dramatic restructuring, as sometimes claimed online? Less certain without robust evidence. But improving posture is generally beneficial.
Okay, sensible take. Next question. I had braces and extractions as a kid. Am I doomed to have breathing problems? Sarah?
Definitely not doomed. Many people have extractions and are fine. But, as the chapter suggests, for some people, it can be a contributing factor to a smaller mouth and potential airway issues later on. It doesn't guarantee problems, but if someone is experiencing issues like snoring, fatigue, or suspected sleep apnea, it's worth being aware of this potential link and maybe discussing airway-focused assessments or therapies, like myofunctional therapy or expansion options, with knowledgeable dentists or doctors. Awareness is the first step.
Good advice. Last one. Besides chewing gum more, what are practical ways to increase chewing stress?
Great question. Think about incorporating more whole, less processed foods naturally. Instead of juice, eat the whole fruit. Choose raw, crunchy vegetables, like carrots or celery, as snacks instead of chips. Opt for nuts and seeds. Basically, give your jaws a bit more of a workout with the food you're already eating. Some people do use specific hard chewing gums like Phyleme, but simply choosing less processed food helps.
Makes sense. Eat like our ancestors. A little bit more. Okay, Sarah, can you wrap up the key takeaways from this chew chapter for us?
Sure. I'd say, 1. Modern humans often breathe poorly, partly because our faces and mouths have physically changed, becoming smaller over time, largely due to dietary shifts. 2. A major, often overlooked, reason for this shrinkage is the lack of chewing stress from soft processed foods, which fails to stimulate proper jaw and facial growth. 3. Nasal breathing is vital, but these structural changes create obstructions. 4. While surgery exists for obstruction, there are risks and lifestyle factors like proper oral posture, mewing, and increasing chewing difficulty, potentially aided by expansion appliances like the homeoblock, might help improve airway function and even stimulate bone growth, offering hope for reversal even in adulthood.
Fantastic summary, Sarah. This chapter really gives you something to chew on. Sorry, couldn't resist.
Nice one, James.
Indeed. A compelling synthesis of anthropology, dentistry, and physiology.
All right, that's all the time we have for today's Penplexity. What book or topic should we get perplexed by next? Let us know. Find us on social media @Penplexity or visit our website, penplexity.com. Thanks so much to Sarah and Ethan for another great chat.
Always fun.
A pleasure.
And thank you for listening. Until next time, keep reading, keep questioning, and maybe chew your food a bit more. Bye for now. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Penplexity, the podcast where we get tangled up in the fascinating world of books. I'm your host, James, and today we're diving deep into Chapter 8 of James Nestor's Breath. It's called More on Occasion. And let me tell you, after the last few chapters focusing on slow, gentle breathing, this one, well, it kind of throws a wrench in the works. We're going extreme today, folks. Luckily, I've got my partners in Perplexity here to help unravel it all. We've got the wonderfully insightful Sarah.
Hey James, excited to be here. Yeah, this chapter is definitely a gear shift, isn't it? It's like, okay, we learned the basics, now let's try the respiratory equivalent of I don't know, base jumping?
Ha! Exactly. And of course, we have the ever-sharp, ever-skeptical, scientific Ethan.
Skeptical implies doubt, James. I prefer rigorously curious. But yes, this chapter presents some, shall we say, energetic techniques that certainly warrant a closer look from a physiological standpoint. More on occasion is quite the understatement.
All right, so Sarah, Nestor calls these techniques breathing plus. What's the deal? Why move beyond the slow and steady stuff we've been learning?
Well, Nestor basically says, look, the slow nasal breathing is foundational, right? But there are these other ancient practices involving really fast breathing or really slow breathing for long periods, or even holding your breath for minutes, that offer extra rewards, as he puts it. They're not easy, they can be uncomfortable, they might even make you sweat or feel nauseous.
Sounds lovely.
But the idea is that consciously pushing your body into these extreme states medicine usually sees as damaging, like respiratory acidosis or sympathetic overload, can actually be incredibly transformative when done willingly and for short periods. It's about building resilience, maybe?
It's a fascinating premise. Medicine typically views conditions like hypocapnia, low CO2 from overbreathing, or extreme apnea as pathological. Nestor is exploring traditions that harness these states volitionally. The key distinction he seems to make, and which Nestor experiences himself later, is the conscious versus unconscious induction of these states.
Right. Which brings us to Civil War soldiers. That's where Nestor kicks off this exploration with Jacob Mendez da Costa.
Yeah! It's such a wild starting point. Dr. da Costa, back in the 1860s, saw all these Union soldiers coming in, not necessarily wounded in battle, but totally falling apart. Anxiety, chest pain, diarrhea, dizziness, breathlessness, huffing and puffing, but never feeling like they could catch a breath.
And these guys hadn't even seen action sometimes?
Exactly. They showed no physical damage. Da Costa examined them and found their hearts were racing, like 200 beats per minute sometimes, and they were breathing super fast, maybe 30 times a minute. He called it irritable heart syndrome.
Da Costa himself suspected a disorder of the sympathetic nervous system, and he was likely onto something. What he described sounds very much like a chronic state of sympathetic nervous system activation, the fight-or-flight response stuck in the on position. It's fascinating how this pattern reappeared in later conflicts, just with different names. Shell shock, soldier's heart, PTSD.
And Nestor ties this right back to his own experience in the chapter, lying on a yoga mat in a park with this guy Chuck McGee III, deliberately overbreathing.
Yeah, describe that scene, Sarah. Nestor says he felt his heart beating violently, anxious, sweaty, basically inducing Da Costa's syndrome on himself.
Pretty much. McGee is coaching him through this intense breathing, yelling, 20 more! Nestor feels like a rodent is loose in his chest. It's sympathetic overload, deliberately triggered.
Which highlights the core concept Nestor explores. The autonomic nervous system isn't purely automatic. We have this parasympathetic side, the rest and digest or feed and breathe system, stimulated by slow, deep breaths, especially engaging the lower lungs and the exhale. It calms us down.
Right, like after a big meal or during a massage.
Precisely. Then there's the sympathetic side, triggered by short, hasty breaths, stimulating nerves higher in the lungs. This gears us up for action. Increased heart rate, adrenaline, blood flow redirected to muscles. Essential for emergencies, but we're designed for it to be short-lived.
But we live in a world of constant low-grade stress, right? So we're kind of stuck in a half-sympathetic state?
That's the modern predicament Nestor touches upon, referencing Dr. Stephen Porges's work on the vagus nerve. Chronic, unresolved stress can lead to a state where the vagal system keeps organs in a sort of suspended animation, not fully supported, communication choppy. Porges suggests this breakdown in autonomic communication underlies many chronic conditions.
And Nestor argues that these breathing plus techniques are a way to consciously hijack that system, to intentionally hit the sympathetic, quote, gas pedal, so you can then learn to hit the parasympathetic brake more effectively. McGee yells at him, "You are not the passenger. You are the pilot."
Okay, so the technique Nestor was doing with McGee, that's Tomo, right? The inner fire meditation from Tibetan Buddhism?
Exactly. It dates back to around the 10th century with Naropa, this Indian scholar who used it to stay warm in Himalayan caves. It was considered dangerous, kept secret for centuries, until people like Alexandre David Niel, this amazing Belgian-French explorer, learned it in the early 1900s and used it to survive trekking in freezing temperatures.
She sounds incredible. Starving herself, Freemasonry, feminism, hiking the Himalayas. Wow.
Totally. She emphasized it wasn't just religious, but a practical tool. She'd hike for 19 hours a day above 18,000 feet using it.
And for a long time, the West dismissed these abilities. The idea that breathing alone could generate significant heat or influence the immune system seemed biologically implausible. The autonomic nervous system was considered, well, autonomic, beyond conscious control. It took researchers like Herbert Benson at Harvard in the 80s actually measuring monks practicing Tumo to start changing minds.
What did Benson find?
He hooked monks up to sensors and found the temperature in their fingers and toes increased by as much as 17 degrees Fahrenheit during Tumo practice. Published in Nature. That got people's attention, but it still seemed inaccessible, like something only monks could do.
Until Wim Hof came along.
Ah, yes, the Iceman. Running marathons in deserts without water, sitting in ice baths for nearly 2 hours.
Right. He looked like a regular middle-aged Dutch guy, not some ancient mystic. He'd faced personal tragedy, found solace in breathing practices, rediscovered Tumo, simplified it, and started doing these insane stunts.
And crucially, scientists did pay attention. The 2011 Radboud University study was pivotal. They injected Hof with an E. coli endotoxin, which normally causes flu-like symptoms.
And Hoff just breathed his way through it?
He performed his breathing technique and showed virtually no symptoms. No fever, no nausea. Then, Hof insisted anyone could do it. So, in a follow-up study, they trained a group of volunteers for 10 days in his method. Heavy breathing plus cold exposure.
Like playing soccer shirtless in the snow, those poor guys.
Indeed, then they injected both the trained group and a control group with the endotoxin. The trained group could consciously control their heart rate, temperature, and immune response. The breathing released stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, norepinephrine, on command. Adrenaline boosted energy and immune cells. Cortisol dampened inflammation. Norepinephrine redirected blood flow.
So it really does hack the system. How do you actually do the Wim Hof method?
Nestor lays it out. Lie down, take 30 really deep, fast breaths, like a wave, stomach then chest, breathing in fully, letting go quickly, maybe through the nose or pursed lips. After the 30th breath, exhale naturally, leaving some air in, and hold your breath for as long as you can. Then, a huge recovery inhale. Hold that for 15 seconds, maybe gently move the air around your chest, exhale, and repeat the whole cycle 3 or 4 times.
And the cold exposure is key too?
Yeah, Hof incorporates cold showers, ice baths, naked snow angels. Nestor says this flip-flopping, intense breathing, then holding, cold, then hot, is the magic. It forces the body between high stress and deep relaxation, making it more adaptable.
It sounds intense, but McGee's story is pretty compelling. He had type 1 diabetes, chronic pain, depression, high blood pressure, and Hof's method helped him drastically reduce meds and feel better?
Yeah, his insulin needs dropped 80%, blood pressure normalized, pain subsided. He felt it rebalanced his body, addressing what might be an underlying autonomic dysfunction, which Nestor notes is increasingly linked to autoimmune diseases affecting millions.
Wow. It's amazing how reconnecting with something so fundamental like breath, and maybe challenging our bodies in these ways, could potentially help rebalance our health. You know, speaking of getting our systems back on track and finding holistic balance, like McGee did, this seems like a good moment to mention our sponsor, Sharan. Sharan stands for Sanctuary for Health and Reconnection to Animals and Nature. They're dedicated to spreading awareness about holistic health and an ecologically sustainable, compassionate lifestyle. They've got a whole team of doctors, nutritionists, and health coaches focused on building a culture of health. Their mission is to empower you to make long-term lifestyle changes to reach your highest health potential using methods based on scientific evidence. They've helped over 100,000 people worldwide through books, talks, workshops, retreats, and consultations. It's all about vibrant well-being. You can find them at www.sharon-india.org.
That sounds fantastic. Aligning lifestyle with health, really getting to the root causes. Definitely check them out, listeners.
Indeed. Addressing health holistically, considering the interconnectedness of our systems, is crucial. Sharan seems like a valuable resource for that.
Okay, so back to the breathing. Nestor includes some important warnings, right? This stuff isn't for everyone or everywhere.
Absolutely. McGee repeatedly warns Nestor, and Nestor passes it on. Never practice Tummo or Hof-style breathing while driving, swimming, or anywhere passing out could be dangerous. And avoid it if you have heart conditions or are pregnant.
And there are valid questions about the long-term effects. As Nestor mentions, Anders Olsen, the slow-breathing advocate from earlier chapters, worries that forced overbreathing might be counterproductive in our already, quote, adrenaline society. We lack extensive longitudinal studies on these specific, intense methods.
But then Nestor brings up Alexandra David-Nel living to 100, and this other guy, Maurice Dobard.
Yeah, Dobard. He apparently cured himself of tuberculosis and other illnesses using Tummo back when doctors had given up on him. He did Hof-like feats decades before Hof, sitting in ice, running barefoot in snow, cycling the Himalayas at 71. And as of the book's writing, he was 89, still leading Tummo retreats, believing it's key to reconstituting the immune system.
These are compelling anecdotes, certainly. They suggest profound resilience can be cultivated. However, scientifically, we need to differentiate between individual case studies, however remarkable, and broader, controlled evidence regarding long-term impacts and general applicability.
Fair point. Now, there's another heavy breathing technique Nestor explores, holotropic breathwork. This sounds even wilder.
Oh yeah. Developed by Czech psychiatrist Stanislav Grof after LSD was banned, he was looking for a non-drug way to achieve similar altered states for therapy. His method involves lying down, often in the dark, with loud, evocative music, and breathing as hard and fast as possible for up to 3 hours.
3 hours?
Physiologically, that's a significant duration of hyperventilation.
The idea is that this extreme, willing stress helps access subconscious thoughts, break down mental barriers, moving towards wholeness. As the name implies, hollows meaning whole, trepain meaning moving toward. But it can involve a, quote, dark night of the soul, intense emotional release, sometimes vomiting or breakdowns.
Yikes. But potentially leading to mystical visions, breakthroughs, even mini life-death rebirth experiences.
That's what Grof and practitioners like Dr. James Eierman reported. Eierman used it with over 11,000 patients, including schizophrenics and manic depressives, documenting significant benefits where meds failed. Patients reported out-of-body experiences, profound shifts in perspective, overcoming addiction.
From a mechanistic perspective, Grof theorized, and Nestor explains, that the intense hyperventilation drastically reduces CO2, constricting blood vessels and cutting blood flow to the brain by up to 40%. Areas governing vision, memory, sense of self are most affected, potentially triggering hallucinations and altered states.
Okay, that makes a kind of sense.
Furthermore, the sustained pH imbalance and stress signals might trick the primitive limbic system into perceiving a life-threatening situation, potentially explaining the, quote, death rebirth phenomena reported.
But Nestor's own experience, trying it, he seemed a bit skeptical, right? He felt the physical stuff, heat, cold, numbness, the claw hands or tetany.
Yeah, tetany is a common side effect of severe hyperventilation, muscle contractions, due to the chemical changes.
But he also watched other people, like Ben, growling like a wolf, and Mary having this intense breakdown, and he noted they weren't breathing any harder than he was. He wondered how much was the breathing itself versus the set and setting, the environment, the expectation, the music.
That's a crucial question in studying any consciousness-altering practice. The psychological framing, the facilitator's guidance, the group energy, these factors profoundly shape subjective experience. Disentangling the direct physiological effects of the breathing from these potent psychosocial influences is incredibly difficult.
But Groff and Eierman would argue that even if the quote setting helps unlock it, the breath is the key, and the therapeutic outcomes reported by thousands are real, regardless of the precise mechanism. It provides that heavy shove some people need.
It's definitely a lot to chew on. Okay, let's take a few questions from our listeners. First one, could these intense breathing techniques, like Wim Hof's, help with chronic pain? Sarah, what do you think based on the chapter?
Well, McGee's story certainly suggests it. His chronic back pain subsided significantly. The theory is that by influencing the autonomic nervous system and potentially reducing inflammation through those cortisol bursts Ethan mentioned, it could help manage certain types of chronic pain, especially those linked to autoimmune issues or chronic stress states. But again, the caution is key.
I'd add that the release of endogenous opioids during such practices might also contribute to short-term pain relief. Whether it addresses the root cause depends heavily on the nature of the pain. More research is needed, but the link between stress modulation and pain perception is well established.
Good points. Okay, next question. Is the cold exposure absolutely necessary for the Wim Hof method benefits, Ethan?
The studies Nestor cites often combine the breathing with cold exposure, suggesting a synergistic effect. Cold is another potent stressor that forces adaptation. The breathing likely primes the body, releasing adrenaline and altering blood flow, which might enhance the tolerance to cold and the subsequent hormonal responses. However, the breathing alone demonstrably impacts the autonomic nervous system and immune markers. So while cold adds another layer, the breathing itself is a powerful component.
Makes sense. Final question. With holotropic breathwork, how do they ensure safety during those intense emotional releases Nestor described? Sarah?
That's where the set and setting become crucial for safety. Nestor mentions sitters, people watching over the breathers. Trained facilitators guide the sessions, create a safe container, and are prepared to support participants through difficult experiences without interfering unnecessarily. Groff developed specific protocols over decades to manage these intense processes responsibly. It's not something to be done casually or without experienced guidance.
Definitely. Sounds like it requires expertise. All right, fantastic discussion. Before we wrap up, can one of you summarize the key takeaways from this wild chapter?
I'd say 3 main points emerge. 1. Conscious breathing techniques can indeed influence the supposedly automatic autonomic nervous system, challenging long-held medical beliefs. 2. Intense practices like Tumo, Wim Hof method, and holotropic breathwork deliberately induce physiological stress states, sympathetic activation, hypocapnia, which proponents claim can yield significant health, resilience, and psychological benefits when practiced consciously and carefully. 3. While anecdotal evidence and preliminary studies are compelling, caution is warranted due to potential risks, the influence of psychological factors, and the need for more rigorous long-term research.
Perfectly put, Ethan. Thank you both, Sarah and Ethan, for navigating the extremes of Breathing Plus with me today. It's certainly given us a lot to catch our breath about. Huh.
Always a pleasure, James.
Fascinating territory.
So, listeners, what did you think? And more importantly, what book or chapter should Penplexity get perplexed by next? Let us know. Find us on social media at Penplexity. That's PENPLEXITY. Or visit our website at penplexity.com. Until next time, keep reading, keep thinking, and maybe breathe consciously. See ya! Hello, and welcome back to Penplexity, the podcast where we get perplexed by paragraphs and unravel the brilliant bits from books. I'm your host, James, and today, oh boy, today we're diving into Chapter 9 of James Nestor's Breath. It's called Hold It, which honestly sounds a bit ominous, maybe exciting. Let's find out. Back with me are our resident experts in making sense of the sensational, the ever-lively Sarah, and the brilliantly brainy Ethan. Welcome back, guys.
Hey, James. Excited to be back. And yeah, hold it. It definitely makes you take a sharp inhale, doesn't it?
Indeed, a title that immediately engages a physiological response. Clever. Hello, James, Sarah.
right? So, Sarah, kick us off. This chapter starts pretty intensely. Monkeys in Puerto Rico?
Oh, it really does. So back in the 60s, this researcher, Dr. Arthur Kling, did these experiments. And fair warning, they're pretty grim. He captured wild monkeys, performed surgery to remove a part of their brain, specifically the amygdala on both sides, let them recover, and then release them back into the wild.
Okay, amygdala. I've heard of those. That's like the fear center, right?
Largely considered so, yes. 2 almond-sized nodes deep in the temporal lobes. They're crucial for processing emotions, decision-making, memory, and critically identifying threats and initiating that fight-or-flight response. They're the brain's alarm system for danger.
Exactly, and Kling removed them. The monkeys looked normal, maybe a scar, but behaviorally, they were lost. They couldn't tell friend from foe, predator from prey. They didn't sense danger. Some walked into rivers and drowned. Others approached rival troops. Kling repeated this in Zambia, and those monkeys vanished within hours. The takeaway was stark. Without fear, mediated by the amygdala, survival was basically impossible.
Wow, that's dark. But fascinating. It really hammers home how vital fear is, I guess, even though we usually think of it as a negative thing.
From an evolutionary standpoint, fear is fundamentally protective. It's a survival mechanism honed over millennia. Removing it, as Kling demonstrated rather brutally, is removing a critical component of the organism's ability to navigate its environment safely.
And then the chapter shifts to a human case, SM, who had a similar condition but naturally occurring. She had this rare genetic disease, Urbach vitae, which destroyed her amygdala by the time she was around 10.
So she didn't feel fear either.
Pretty much. Her IQ, senses, memory were all normal. But fear? Gone. She'd approach strangers super closely, share intimate details without any sense of embarrassment. She couldn't even recognize fear in other people's faces, though she could recognize happiness or sadness. The book even recounts this incredibly harrowing incident where she was assaulted, and afterwards she just calmly asked the attacker to drive her home. No lingering terror, no panic.
SM's case became pivotal for researchers studying fear and anxiety. If the amygdala is the fear center and hers are gone, she theoretically shouldn't be able to experience fear. For decades, researchers like Dr. Justin Feinstein, who we meet later in the chapter, tried everything. Haunted houses, snakes, disturbing films, and nothing fazed her. She seemed genuinely fearless.
Okay, hold on. So the monkeys die without the amygdala, but SM survives into her 40s, albeit with some, let's say, unconventional social interactions and dangerous encounters she doesn't react typically to. Is there a difference? Or...
Well, human society provides structures and safety nets that a wild jungle doesn't. SM wasn't constantly facing predators or immediate environmental hazards in the same way Kling's monkeys were. Plus, other cognitive functions might offer some compensatory protection, even if the primary fear circuit is offline. But her life certainly wasn't without significant risk due to her condition.
Right. And this sets the stage for the really big twist. Feinstein, specializing in anxiety, which he defines as rooted in fear, and oversensitivity to perceived threats, basically overactive amygdala, finds this obscure study. It showed that a single breath of concentrated carbon dioxide could induce panic, intense feelings of suffocation, even in people who knew they were safe.
Carbon dioxide? Like the stuff we breathe out. How does that cause panic?
Precisely the question Feinstein pursued. It suggested a fear response that wasn't psychological, wasn't triggered by an external perceived threat processed by the amygdala. It seemed to be a direct physical trigger.
So they set up an experiment. They got SM in, mask on, explained she'd be safe, plenty of oxygen, just a bit of CO2 mixed in, 35%, which is a lot. She looked bored, as usual. They weren't expecting much.
And?
She inhaled. And immediately, bam! Eyes wide, muscles tensed, gasping, waving her arms, yelling, "Help me, I can't breathe!" A full-blown panic attack. The first time she'd felt genuine fear in decades. Her amygdala hadn't grown back. Something else had triggered it.
They confirmed this with 2 other individuals with the same condition, German twins. Same result, intense panic from CO2 inhalation, despite non-functional amygdalae. This was groundbreaking. It meant the textbooks were incomplete. There's another, perhaps even more fundamental, fear circuit in the body, independent of the amygdala.
Wow. Okay. So what is this other circuit?
It relates to the feeling of suffocation, the inability to breathe. This response is mediated by central chemoreceptors located at the base of the brainstem. These neurons constantly monitor the level of carbon dioxide in our blood.
Yeah, this blew my mind. We think we breathe based on needing oxygen, but it's mostly driven by CO2 levels. When CO2 gets too high, meaning we're breathing too slowly or holding our breath, these chemoreceptors sound the alarm, telling us to breathe faster and deeper. If CO2 gets too low, like when we hyperventilate, they signal to slow down.
So that, gotta breathe feeling when you hold your breath, that's the chemoreceptors freaking out about CO2?
Essentially, yes. It's an ancient, fundamental biological response. Sensing CO2 to avoid suffocation is vital for aerobic life, going way back. And in humans, this chemoreception, is plastic. It can adapt.
That's where it gets really interesting for performance and health. Elite athletes, mountaineers climbing Everest without oxygen, freedivers holding their breath for insane amounts of time. They've trained their chemoreceptors to tolerate much higher levels of CO2 without triggering that panic alarm. They've increased their chemoreceptor flexibility.
Flexibility. I like that. So the opposite is true too? People with anxiety might have inflexible chemoreceptors?
That's the hypothesis explored in the chapter. Anxiety, panic disorders. They often involve dysfunctional breathing patterns, typically overbreathing or shallow, erratic breathing. This can lead to chronically low CO2 levels, making the chemoreceptors hypersensitive. The slightest increase in CO2 then triggers that primal suffocation panic, creating a vicious cycle. Anxiety leads to overbreathing, which lowers CO2 tolerance, which makes future panic more likely.
It suggests that maybe psychology has been missing a piece of the puzzle. Treating anxiety might not just be about changing thoughts, but also about retraining this fundamental physical response to CO2. Addressing the breathing.
This connects to something else in the chapter, right? The ancient practices versus email apnea?
Totally. For thousands of years, cultures have practiced conscious breath holding, pranayama in India, specific techniques in ancient China, believing it restored health and longevity. They were intentionally manipulating their breathing, likely training those chemoreceptors.
Contrast that with modern phenomena like continuous partial attention or, quote, email apnea. When we're constantly scanning emails, checking social media, flitting between tasks, our breathing often becomes shallow, erratic, and we might even unconsciously hold our breath for short periods. This isn't intentional training. It's dysfunctional, stress-induced breathing.
And the book mentions Dr. Margaret Chesney's research, suggesting this email apnea can contribute to the same health problems as sleep apnea, hypertension, neurological issues. It's the unconscious, uncontrolled aspect that's harmful versus the conscious, controlled practice of the ancients.
Man, I am so guilty of email apnea. I can feel myself holding my breath right now just thinking about my inbox. It really highlights the difference between unconscious habits and conscious choices for our well-being, which actually reminds me of our fantastic sponsor for today's episode, Sharan.
Oh yeah, Sharan, the sanctuary for health and reconnection to animals and nature. They really fit this theme, don't they?
Perfectly. Sharan is all about empowering people to take conscious control of their health through holistic lifestyle changes. They focus on scientific evidence, using methods tested by doctors to help you achieve vibrant well-being. It's about understanding your body, like we're discussing with breathing, and making informed choices, not just being pushed around by unconscious habits or anxieties.
Absolutely. Their team of doctors, nutritionists, and health coaches helps people make sustainable changes. They've helped over 100,000 people worldwide through books, workshops, consultations. It's about building a culture of health, which feels so relevant after talking about how something as basic as breathing impacts anxiety.
Indeed. Their focus on evidence-based, holistic health aligns with the chapter's implication that understanding and potentially retraining physiological mechanisms, like chemoreceptor sensitivity, could be key to well-being. It's moving beyond just symptom management. Definitely check them out at www.sharan-india.org.
Couldn't agree more. That's Sharan, www.sharan-india.org. sharon-india.org. Big thanks to them. Okay, so back to CO2. Feinstein didn't just discover this CO2 panic trigger, he started thinking about using it therapeutically?
Correct. He revisited historical research. CO2 therapy was actually quite common decades ago. Thermal baths rich in CO2 were used by the Romans and later in European spa towns like Royat for skin conditions, asthma, bronchitis, with reported success.
Yeah, and they even bottled it. In the early 1900s, mixtures of CO2 and oxygen were used to treat strokes, pneumonia, even asphyxia in newborns. Higher concentrations, like 30% CO2, were used for epilepsy and even schizophrenia. Patients in catatonic states would reportedly become lucid and talkative for about 30 minutes after inhaling it.
Whoa, really? So what happened? Why did we stop using it?
That's the mystery. The chapter notes that by the 1950s, this century of research just disappeared. Pharmaceuticals took over pills, creams, steroids, sedatives. These often numb symptoms rather than addressing underlying mechanisms, and the potential of CO2 therapy was largely forgotten. Feinstein points out the original science wasn't disproven, it was just abandoned.
So Feinstein's thinking, maybe this old therapy holds promise for anxiety today, especially given the limitations of current treatments?
Exactly. He talks about how antidepressants like SSRIs, while lifesavers for some, only benefit less than half of patients. Mindfulness meditation is great, but many people, especially anxious ones, struggle to stick with it. Exposure therapy works but can be long and resource-intensive.
Feinstein saw CO2 therapy, essentially controlled breath-holding induced by gas, as a potential hack. A way to directly target and retrain those hypersensitive chemoreceptors in anxious individuals who often have low CO2 tolerance due to chronic overbreathing. It's like exposure therapy for your breathing reflexes.
And this builds on work like Alicia Murray's, who showed panic sufferers could often prevent attacks by slowing their breathing when they felt one coming on, consciously increasing their CO2 levels. She literally told patients the opposite of take a deep breath, more like breathe less or hold your breath.
Okay, so Nestor, the author, actually tries this CO2 therapy with Feinstein, right? The high dose, the SEM level.
He does. He goes to Feinstein's lab in Tulsa, gets hooked up to monitors galvanic skin response for stress sweat, pulse oximeter, and prepares to inhale 35% CO2 from a special bag.
Sounds intense. What was it like?
He describes this metallic taste, like drinking orange juice from an aluminum cup, spreading through his mouth and lungs. Initially, nothing happens. He thinks maybe because he'd been doing breathing exercises, his chemoreceptors were already pretty flexible, like a Wim Hof practitioner Feinstein had tested.
But then the effects hit. A constriction in the throat, like a sock being stuffed in his mouth, vision blurring, feeling like he couldn't breathe, senses being, quote, vacuumed out. A profound, overwhelming panic.
Yikes! Even though he knew intellectually he was safe, plenty of oxygen?
Precisely. That's the point. The fear wasn't mental in that moment. It felt purely mechanical, triggered by the CO2 hitting those chemoreceptors. Any self-talk was useless against that primal alarm.
He had to take 2 more hits as part of the session and panicked again each time. But the idea is that this controlled exposure, this baptism by fire, helps demystify the panic response. It teaches the body on a fundamental level to become more resilient to those CO2 fluctuations. It's exposure therapy for your brainstem.
Man, inducing panic to cure panic. It's counterintuitive, but makes a weird kind of sense after hearing all this. It really reframes anxiety, doesn't it? From just being in your head to having this deep physical breathable component.
It highlights the intricate connection between physiology and psychology, suggesting that modulating one can profoundly impact the other. A potentially powerful, if intense, therapeutic avenue.
Incredible stuff. Okay, let's take a few questions that have come in. First one. Isn't deliberately causing panic like this potentially dangerous or re-traumatizing? Ethan, what do you think?
A valid concern. The crucial distinction is the context. This is done in a controlled laboratory setting, under expert supervision, with safety measures in place. The patient knows what to expect, knows they are physically safe, and the exposure is brief. The aim isn't to traumatize, but to decondition the fear response through controlled exposure, allowing the individual to experience the sensations without catastrophic consequences, thereby reducing their power.
Yeah, and Feinstein actually lowered the dose for most patients from 35% to 15% because the higher dose was just too intense for many to want to continue. It's about finding that therapeutic window, enough to challenge the system, but not so much that it's unbearable.
Makes sense. Okay, next question. So based on this chapter, should we all just be holding our breath more often throughout the day? Sarah?
Ha! Good question, but definitely not in the email apnea sense. The chapter distinguishes sharply between unconscious, stress-induced breath holding, which is harmful, and conscious, controlled practices. Things like pranayama, or techniques taught by breathing coaches, involve specific methods and awareness. So randomly holding your breath isn't the answer, but exploring conscious breathing techniques, maybe with guidance, to improve CO2 tolerance and breathing efficiency. The chapter certainly suggests there's value there. Just don't turn blue checking your Twitter feed.
Noted. Final question. Does all this mean anxiety isn't really a psychological problem after all, but just a physical breathing issue, Ethan?
I wouldn't frame it as an either/or. It's more likely a complex interplay. Psychological stress can undoubtedly trigger poor breathing habits, leading to physical sensitization to CO2. Conversely, a physically sensitized system might make someone more prone to psychological anxiety. What this research emphasizes is a significant, often overlooked physiological component to anxiety that can be directly addressed through breathwork or related therapies. It suggests that treating the physical aspect, retraining the chemoreceptors, improving CO2 tolerance, could be a powerful lever for improving mental state, possibly in conjunction with psychological approaches.
Fascinating. So it adds a dimension, rather than replacing the psychological view. Brilliant. Okay, before we wrap up, can one of you give us the key takeaways from this chapter? Hold it.
Sure. I'd say the big ones are: 1. Fear isn't solely generated by the amygdala. There's a deeper, more primal fear circuit linked to suffocation and triggered by rising CO2 levels detected by chemoreceptors. 2. Our breathing patterns, specifically our tolerance for CO2, are deeply connected to anxiety and panic. Hypersensitivity can create a vicious cycle. 3. This CO2 sensitivity is, quote, plastic, and can potentially be retrained, like athletes do, offering a possible therapeutic target for anxiety. And 4. Conscious breath-holding practices known for centuries might actually work by improving this CO2 tolerance, unlike harmful unconscious breath-holding like email apnea.
Well summarized, Sarah. It fundamentally challenges us to consider the physiological underpinnings of fear and anxiety, opening the door to therapies that work directly with the breath to recalibrate our primal responses.
Excellent points. What a chapter. Makes you really think about every single breath, doesn't it? Huge thanks to Sarah and Ethan for breaking that down for us. So, listeners, what should Penplexity get perplexed by next? Let us know. Find us on social media at Penplexity or visit our website, penplexity.com. Until next time, keep reading, keep thinking, and maybe breathe consciously? Thanks for tuning in. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Penplexity, the podcast where we get perplexed by books in a good way. I'm your host, James, and today we've got the dream team back. The ever-insightful Sarah and the man who makes science sound cool, Ethan.
Hey, James. So happy to be back, ready to get perplexed.
Indeed. Always a pleasure to unravel the complexities. Which chapter are we diving into today?
Right. Today we're tackling Chapter 10 from James Nestor's Breath. It's called Fast, Slow, and Not at All, which already sounds intriguing. Nestor's basically hit a wall, right? He's seen all this wild stuff. Tumo generating heat, holotropic breathwork causing hallucinations, but the why is still missing.
Exactly. He's baffled. Okay, stress hormones might explain some of the cold resistance in Tumo, but sitting naked in snow for hours without frostbite, that's intense. And then you have those monks doing the opposite, breathing slow and less, super relaxed. Metabolism drops like crazy, but they still heat up. It makes no sense by conventional rules.
Yeah, and the holotropic breathwork thing. Nestor mentioned studies showing oxygen levels normalize after the initial heavy breathing, so why the continued, trippy experiences? The usual explanations aren't cutting it.
And that's where Nestor pivots, looking back to ancient wisdom, specifically from India. He suspects the answers lie in concepts Western science hasn't quite grasped yet.
And that brings us to prana. This idea pops up everywhere in yoga circles. It translates roughly to life force or vital energy. Think of it like an ancient theory of atoms, but for, well, everything. The book says, the concrete, your clothes, your spouse clanking dishes, it's all swirling energy. It's prana.
Clanking dishes definitely feels like a specific kind of energy some mornings. So this prana idea wasn't just India, right?
Nope. Nestor points out it was documented around the same time, like 3,000 years ago in China too. They called it chi. The Japanese called it ki, Greeks pneuma, Hebrews ruah, different names, same basic idea. Everything has this vital energy. More prana, more alive. Block the flow, you get sick. Lose too much. Well, you know.
And crucially, these cultures developed myriad ways to cultivate and manage this energy. Acupuncture, specific postures, even spicy foods were thought to contain lots of prana.
But the most powerful way? Breathing. Inhaling prana. It was so fundamental that words like qi and ruah are synonymous with breath or respiration. The Chinese system qigong literally means breath work. Breathing is expanding your life force, according to this view.
Okay, so ancient wisdom says breathe the prana, but science is like, hold on, we can't measure prana with our gadgets. Which leads us to Swami Rama?
Ah yes, Swami Rama, a fascinating case study from 1970. He walked into the Menninger Clinic, a major psychiatric center, looking every bit the part. Robes, beads, the whole deal. Dr. Elmer Green, a former weapons physicist turned mind-body researcher, wanted to test his abilities.
And the results were pretty mind-blowing. Rama could consciously shift his brainwaves from hyperactive beta down to delta, deep sleep waves, yet remain aware enough to recall conversations happening around him. He called it yogic sleep.
He also demonstrated remarkable control over his heart. He slowed it significantly, sped it up rapidly, and even induced what looked like cardiac arrest but was actually atrial flutter, beating at an insane 300 beats per minute, a rate that should be fatal. Yet, he was fine, claiming he could hold it for half an hour.
300 beats? That's... wow. And he could change his hand temperature too?
Correct. He created an 11-degree Fahrenheit difference between his pinky and thumb, just by willing it, presumably by controlling blood flow or something else. Importantly, Nestor emphasizes that standard measures like blood gases, pH, stress hormones, they didn't explain Rama's abilities. It pointed towards that other strange prana force.
And Rama wasn't unique. Nestor mentions earlier accounts of yogis stopping their hearts, controlling sweat, fingertip temperature. It suggests these, quote, superhuman feats were maybe not so superhuman within that specific tradition of practice.
So Rama could do it, but did he explain how? Did he spill the prana secrets?
He taught basics, like harmonizing the breath, making it continuous, no pauses between inhale and exhale, and lengthening the breath, especially the exhale. He suggested aiming for a 30-second exhale after months of practice, promising freedom from toxins and disease, even silky smooth skin.
30-second exhale? I think I'd pass out. But the really powerful stuff? The deep prana control secrets? Sounds like he kept those closer to his chest.
Which brings us to another key figure Nestor introduces, Albert Szent-Györgyi, a Nobel Prize-winning scientist, not a yogi.
Right, the vitamin C guy who nearly flunked out of school. I love those details. What was his angle?
Szent-Györgyi looked at breathing and life energy from a subatomic perspective. He proposed that life itself is fundamentally about the movement and transfer of electrons. Remember basic chemistry. Atoms have protons, neutrons, electrons.
Oh boy, science flashback.
Stay with me. St. Georgi argued that what distinguishes living things from, say, rocks is the excitability of their electrons, how easily electrons can be transferred. The more easily electrons move, the more, quote, desaturated matter becomes, the more alive it is.
Desaturated? Like colors? How does that work?
Think of it as potential energy. Early life forms were weak electron acceptors, not much energy transfer, not much evolution. Then oxygen came along, a strong electron acceptor. Life that evolved to use oxygen could exchange way more electrons, gain more energy, and evolve rapidly.
Okay, so oxygen lets us swap electrons more easily, giving us more energy?
Essentially, yes. And St. Georgi linked this to health. When cells can efficiently absorb and transfer electrons, they stay healthy. When they lose this ability, they start to break down. He used the analogy of rusting.
Humans. Rusting? That's slightly terrifying.
It's a powerful metaphor. He suggested that tissues rust when they can't attract enough oxygen, slowing electron exchange, leading to abnormal growth. He specifically noted that cancers often develop and thrive in low oxygen environments. So, the key to health? Keep that electron exchange lively by flooding tissues with oxygen.
Which comes back to breathing, slow, nasal breathing specifically, to balance respiratory gases and maximize oxygen delivery to all tissues.
Exactly. St. Georgi said, in every culture and in every medical tradition before ours, healing was accomplished by moving energy. For him, that energy was, fundamentally, the movement of electrons, facilitated by oxygen, driven by breath. Prana, chi, ruah. Maybe different names for the observable effects of this fundamental bioelectrical process.
Whoa. So is prana just electrons zipping around thanks to oxygen? That feels a bit less mystical.
Well, it's a compelling scientific framework, right? St. Georgi gives us a potential mechanism for why breathing properly is so vital for health at a really basic cellular level. But does it capture the entirety of what the ancients meant by prana? Maybe not. They often spoke of an energy in the air itself, a vital quality we inhale, not just the oxygen molecule.
That's a key distinction. St. Georgi described the body's reaction to oxygen and its role in energy transfer. The ancient concepts might posit something more, an energy inherent to the breath or the universe that we absorb. Science hasn't measured that energy directly. However, it has measured the profound physiological effects of manipulating respiration, the things Swami Rama did, the heat generation, and Tumo. St. Georgi's electron theory offers a plausible explanation for how the body might achieve some of these states of enhanced resilience and function.
Okay. My brain is buzzing now. Electrons, prana, yogic sleep. It makes sense why Nestor went to Brazil to see this expert de Rose. What was his take?
Right, Luiz Sergio Alvarez de Rose. A big deal in Brazil, decorated like a statesman, author of 30 books on the oldest forms of yoga. Nestor meets him, and de Rose basically confirms that ancient yoga, or yoga as he calls it, emphasizing the lineage, was vastly different.
Different how? Less stretchy pants?
Definitely. Nestor describes finding evidence of yoga's origins way back, like 5,000 years ago, in the Indus-Sarasvati civilization. These were advanced cities, but interestingly, no temples, no religious icons found. What was found were seals showing figures in seated meditation postures, belly full of air, clearly focused on breathing.
And the word asana originally just meant seat or posture, the act of sitting, or the thing you sat on. It wasn't about flowing through poses.
Exactly. Ancient yoga, according to de Rose, was about holding still, often in difficult postures for a long time, to focus intensely on the breath and build prana. It wasn't for fixing problems, but for healthy people to reach their next level potential, controlling body heat, expanding consciousness, influencing the nervous system, living longer.
So the downward dogs and sun salutations came later?
Much later, mostly in the 20th century. De Rose calls that vinyasa flow stuff a kind of aerobic dance, a hybrid, which isn't bad. Millions practice it and get benefits like flexibility and feeling good. But it's fundamentally different from the original yoga focused on breath and internal energy.
And what did de Rose say about Nestor's intense Sudarshan Kriya experience? The sweating, loss of time, feeling altered for days?
De Rose wasn't surprised. He basically said Nestor built up too much prana, too fast, without being adapted to handle it. Sudarshan Kriya, like Tumo, comes from these ancient powerful practices. Nestor's good vision, Sudarshan means good vision, was just way overboard. Hallucinating, freaking out, that wasn't the goal. It's a sign you pushed too hard.
It highlights the need for patience and gradual adaptation when working with these potent techniques. You can't just hack thousands of years of refined practice.
Right. Build a foundation first, which makes me think about building a foundation for health in general. You know, this whole chapter, connecting ancient wisdom, modern science, breathing, energy, well-being, it actually reminds me of our sponsor for today's episode, Sharan.
Oh, Sharan, Sanctuary for Health and Reconnection to Animals and Nature. That fits perfectly.
Doesn't it? They're all about spreading awareness of holistic health, sustainable and compassionate living. They've got doctors, nutritionists, health coaches, a whole team focused on building a culture of health.
Their mission resonates with the chapter's themes, empowering people to make long-term lifestyle changes to reach their highest health potential. Like mastering breathing, it's about taking conscious control.
Exactly. And their methods are based on scientific evidence, used by doctors, but also aligned with that holistic view. They've helped over 100,000 people through books, workshops, retreats, consultations. Really empowering stuff.
Yeah, definitely check them out if you're interested in vibrant well-being through lifestyle changes. Sharan seems like a fantastic resource. Their website is www.sharan-india.org.
Indeed, supporting holistic health initiatives like Sharan aligns well with understanding the deeper connections between our habits, our environment, and our vitality, themes central to Nestor's work. Again, that's www.sharan-india.org.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Okay, let's dive into a few questions from our listeners. First up, from deepbreather_77 feet. If ancient yoga was mainly sitting and breathing, where did all the poses in modern yoga come from? Sarah, you touched on this.
Yeah, great question. As DeRose points out, and history confirms, the dynamic flowing sequences we often see today really developed much, much later, primarily in the 20th century. It was influenced by things like European gymnastics, Indian physical culture movements, and a desire to make yoga more accessible and physically engaging for a wider audience. So it blended the ancient name and some postures with more modern exercise principles.
Got it. Next, Quantum Curious asks, is Szent-György's electron theory widely accepted today as the explanation for prana? Ethan?
An important clarification. Szent-György's work on cellular respiration and the role of oxygen in electron transfer is foundational biochemistry, absolutely accepted science. His framing of this as the underlying mechanism for life energy, or as a potential explanation for concepts like prana, is more of a compelling hypothesis or a philosophical bridge. It provides a scientifically grounded way to think about how breath fuels life at the most basic level. However, it's not typically presented in mainstream science as a direct, one-to-one explanation for the ancient, multifaceted concept of prana, especially its more subtle or non-physical aspects. It explains the bioenergetics, but maybe not the whole prana picture as understood traditionally.
Okay, makes sense. One more. Zaina Seeker wants to know, can anyone learn to control their body temp or heart rate like Swami Rama just by breathing?
Well, achieving Swami Rama's level of control, like that 300 beats per minute heart thing, or consciously heating specific fingers, likely requires decades of dedicated, intensive practice, maybe specific innate abilities too. It's pretty extreme. But can anyone use breath to significantly influence their physiology? Absolutely. Things like slowing your heart rate, calming your nervous system, improving heart rate variability, managing stress responses, even subtly influencing body temperature. These are well-documented effects of various breathing practices that are accessible to most people with regular training. You might not stop your heart, but you can definitely gain a surprising amount of control over your internal state.
Precisely. The autonomic nervous system isn't entirely automatic. Breathing is a direct lever we can use to influence it. While Rama represents the far end of the spectrum, the fundamental principle of breath-modulating physiology applies to everyone.
Excellent answers. So wrapping up this fascinating chapter, Sarah, could you give us the key takeaways?
Sure. I think the big ones are: 1. Ancient cultures worldwide recognized a vital life force, often called prana or chi, and saw breathing as the primary way to cultivate it. 2. Specific breathing techniques developed over millennia and seen in practices like Tummo, Sudarshan Kriya, and ancient yoga can produce extraordinary measurable effects on our bodies, like generating heat, altering consciousness, and controlling autonomic functions. 3. While science may not measure, quote, prana directly, people like Swami Rama proved profound mind-body control linked to breath is possible, and scientists like St. Georgi offered compelling theories, like the electron transfer model, explaining how breath fuels life, energy, and health at a fundamental level. 4. Remember that ancient yoga was originally about stillness, breath, and energy, quite different from much of modern aerobic yoga. And finally, maybe the most important point Nestor makes at the end. All these diverse techniques, from pranayama to buteyko to tummo, tap into the same innate, powerful capacity we all have within us. The power of breath isn't lost, it's just waiting.
Brilliantly put, Sarah. It really feels like Nestor's tying together so many threads here. Okay, that's all the time we have for this episode of Penplexity. Huge thanks to Sarah and Ethan for sharing their amazing insights.
Always fun.
My pleasure.
So what should we get perplexed by next? Let us know. Hit us up on social media at Penplexity, that's PENPLEXITY, or visit our website, penplexity.com. Don't forget to follow so you don't miss our next deep dive. Until then, keep breathing and keep thinking. Bye for now. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Penplexity, the podcast where we get perplexed by pages and untangle the text together. I'm your host, James, and today we're diving into the final thoughts, the last gasp, if you will, of James Nestor's incredible book, Breath. It's the epilogue, wrapping up a decade of research, and who better to help us unpack it than our regulars, the ever-insightful Sarah and the brilliantly brainy Ethan.
Hey, James. Oh, I'm so ready for this. The epilogue really ties everything together, but also kind of leaves you thinking, doesn't it?
Indeed. It serves as a crucial calibration, James, a reminder of both the profound potential and the necessary boundaries of the concepts explored throughout the book. Hello?
Boundaries and potential. I like that, Ethan. So Sarah, Nestor kicks off reflecting on 10 years since he first felt the, quotes, possibilities of breathing. What's the big takeaway from that decade for him?
Right, so he revisits this breathing class, and reflects on everything he's learned. And the core message is, yes, breathing techniques are amazing, sometimes unfathomable, as he says, and it's a big but, they aren't magic bullets. He shares these really sobering stories, right? People asking him for breathing techniques to cure a pulmonary embolism or stage 4 cancer.
Yeah, that hit me too, like desperate people looking for any hope.
Exactly. And Nestor is very clear. Those situations need urgent medical attention. Breathing exercises can't just poof, make a blood clot disappear, or reverse severe genetic diseases. He emphasizes he wouldn't be alive without modern medicine, like antibiotics and immunizations.
Which is a fundamentally important distinction. It's easy, particularly when excited by new knowledge, to overextend its application. Nestor grounds the enthusiasm by acknowledging the life-saving, acute care triumphs of modern medicine. Think trauma surgery, infection control, indispensable.
But then he pivots, right? He talks to doctors, like Dr. Gelb and his own father-in-law, Dr. Story, a pulmonologist, and they echo this idea that modern medicine, while amazing for emergencies, often falls short with chronic, milder stuff.
Ah yes, the Walking Dead quote from Dr. Gelb. That's quite a phrase.
It is. Things like asthma, headaches, stress, autoimmune issues, the stuff so many of us deal with daily. The doctors feel frustrated because they don't have the time or support to really prevent these things or treat them deeply. They're putting out fires, not clearing the smoke, as Nestor puts it.
And this creates a gap. Patients with these chronic, systemic, but not immediately life-threatening conditions often feel underserved. They aren't dire enough for the focused attention they need. It's a systemic challenge in healthcare delivery models focused on crisis intervention rather than longitudinal wellness.
So breathing techniques kind of step into that gap?
That's exactly the idea. Nestor positions breathing, much like Eastern medicine traditions, as preventative maintenance. It's about keeping balance in the body so maybe those milder issues don't snowball into bigger problems. And if we lose balance, breathing can often help bring it back.
He quotes that Nobel laureate, Szent-Györgyi?
Yeah, Albert Szent-Györgyi, who basically said our bodies are pretty near perfect and most ailments are due to us abusing it. Nestor connects this to diseases of civilization, things like diabetes, heart disease, stroke, largely caused by our modern lifestyle, our food, our environment.
The concept of diseases of civilization, or mismatched diseases, is well established in anthropology and evolutionary medicine. Our physiology evolved under very different environmental pressures. Modern diets, sedentary behavior, chronic stress, altered air quality. These create novel challenges our bodies aren't always equipped to handle smoothly. Breathing patterns are definitely part of that environmental input.
And Nestor argues breathing is a key input, just like diet and exercise. He calls it a, quote, missing pillar of health. He even quotes Dr. Andrew Weil saying if he had just one tip for healthier living, it'd be to learn to breathe better.
Wow, one tip. That's a strong endorsement. So the epilogue then goes into a kind of greatest hits of breathing better, right? Starting with, shut your mouth.
Yes, the Stanford experiment recap. He and Anders Olsen taped their mouths shut for 10 days, forcing mouth breathing. The results were pretty awful. Stress hormones spiked, blood pressure went up, heart rate variability plummeted. Nestor got a bacterial infection in his nose.
The physiological consequences are predictable, though the speed might surprise some. The nasal passages perform crucial functions: filtering, warming, humidifying air, and producing nitric oxide, which aids vasodilation and oxygen uptake. Bypassing this system chronically stresses the body.
And the sleep? Oh my gosh. They started snoring heavily almost immediately, then developed sleep apnea within days. Nestor makes the point that while a few gasps through the mouth during exercise or laughing are fine, chronic mouth breathing is just not how we're designed to function.
Did anything not change? Or any surprises?
Yeah, he mentions blood sugar didn't change much, nor did blood cell counts. A surprise was Nestor's lactate levels decreased, suggesting more aerobic energy use, which is kinda counterintuitive. And he lost a couple of pounds, likely from water loss through exhalation. But he jokes, a post-holiday mouth-breathing diet is not recommended.
Ha! Definitely noted. So the obvious antidote, breathe through your nose?
Instantly better. As soon as they removed the plugs and tape, blood pressure dropped, CO2 levels normalized, heart rates were better. Snoring basically vanished in 2 days. The nose infection cleared up on its own. They literally cured themselves just by switching back to nasal breathing.
It underscores the nose's role as the primary respiratory organ. The experiment, while an N of 2, provides a stark experiential and quantitative demonstration of the differential effects. It's also interesting that a Stanford colleague, Ann Kearney, was inspired to plan a larger study on sleep tape.
And performance. Nestor improved his bike performance by 10% just by nasal breathing. Olsen saw about 5%. Even a small edge is huge for athletes. Nestor also gets really personal, feeling emotional about those first nasal breaths, thinking about people suffering from chronic congestion or, quote, empty nose syndrome.
It's powerful stuff. Okay, next big point. Exhale?
Yes, exhale fully. This comes from Carl Stuff's work. Most of us apparently take really shallow breaths and don't fully empty our lungs. Stuff trained people, even those with emphysema plus opera singers, athletes, to exhale longer and more completely. It seems basic, but fully exhaling allows for a fuller inhale, moves the diaphragm properly, and just makes the whole system more efficient.
Mechanically, a full exhalation recruits expiratory muscles more effectively and optimizes the starting volume for the next inhalation, potentially improving gas exchange efficiency and diaphragm function over time. It ensures we're not constantly topping up on stale air.
Makes sense. Okay, the next one always gets me. Chew?
Yeah! Chew more! Nestor talks about looking at ancient skulls. Huge sinuses, strong jaws, straight teeth. The theory is, our ancestors chewed much tougher food for hours a day, which stimulated facial bone growth. Our modern soft processed diets don't provide that stimulation.
So we can remodel our faces by chewing?
Well, he says facial bones can grow and remodel even into our 70s, unlike other bones. So yeah, the idea is we can influence our mouth size and shape, improving our breathing ability. The advice isn't just eat like grandma, because even her food might have been too soft. It's eat like great-great-great-great-grandma, rougher, rawer, heartier stuff. And practice good oral posture, lips together, teeth lightly touching, tongue on the roof of the mouth.
There's certainly evidence for craniofacial plasticity, particularly during development, influenced by masticatory stress. The extent to which significant remodeling can occur in late adulthood solely through chewing is perhaps less established than developmental effects, but the principle of, quote, use it or lose it applies to bone density and muscle tone supporting the airway. The oral posture point is critical for maintaining nasal breathing and proper jaw alignment.
It does make you think about all those smoothies and processed snacks. Okay, moving on. Breathe more on occasion?
Right, this sounds contradictory, because mostly the book advises breathing less. But this is about short bursts of intense, conscious heavy breathing. Techniques like Tumo, which he tried with Chuck McGee, or Sudarshan Kriya, or vigorous pranayamas. The idea is to purposefully stress the body briefly.
Stress it on purpose? Why?
To kinda snap it out of its funk, as McGee apparently said. It helps us regain proper function for the rest of the day. It's like training your autonomic nervous system, becoming the pilot, not just the passenger.
These techniques often involve voluntary hyperventilation, followed by breath holds. This can induce significant short-term physiological shifts, changes in blood gases, low CO2, high O2 initially, altered pH, release of adrenaline. Proponents suggest this hormetic stress can lead to adaptive benefits, improving stress resilience, immune function, and autonomic control over time. But it's definitely distinct from chronic unconscious overbreathing.
Fascinating. Then there's hold your breath. This section got deep into anxiety.
Yeah, really deep. It connects back to Dr. Donald Klein's research on carbon dioxide sensitivity and anxiety, which inspired Justin Feinstein's work. Feinstein found that stimulating the amygdala, the brain's fear center, could actually make people stop breathing, without them even noticing their CO2 rising.
The amygdala's role in respiratory control is an intriguing area. There's bidirectional communication between chemoreceptors sensing CO2 and the amygdala processing emotion and threat. Feinstein's hypothesis is that, in some anxiety disorders, this communication might be disrupted.
Exactly. So the theory goes, anxious people might unconsciously hold their breath. Then, when CO2 builds up too much, the body triggers an emergency breathe now signal, causing panic. To avoid this, they might adapt by constantly overbreathing, keeping CO2 low, but staying in a state of high alert.
So anxiety might not be purely psychological, but tied to this, breathing reflex gone wrong.
That's the potential game-changing idea Feinstein is exploring. Nestor cautions it's still theoretical and needs testing, but it could explain why slow, steady breathing therapy helps so much with anxiety. It might be retraining that CO2 sensitivity and the brain's response.
It reframes anxiety potentially as, in some cases, a physiological response to an internal signal, rather than solely a cognitive or emotional misapprehension. If validated, it could significantly impact treatment approaches, emphasizing interoceptive training and respiratory retraining.
Wow. Okay, before we get to the final point, let's talk about maintaining our overall health, which is a big theme here. You know, finding balance, treating our bodies well. It reminds me of our sponsor for this episode, Sharan.
Oh, great connection, James.
Right? Sharan, that's the sanctuary for health and reconnection to animals and nature, is all about holistic health and sustainable, compassionate living. They're a team of doctors, nutritionists, health coaches, all focused on building a culture of health.
Their mission aligns well with the book's undercurrents, empowering individuals to make long-term lifestyle changes for optimal health potential. Much like Nestor argues, breathing is a fundamental pillar we can consciously improve.
Exactly. Sharan uses scientifically backed, doctor-tested methods focusing on lifestyle changes. They've helped over 100,000 people globally through books, talks, workshops, retreats, consultations. It's about achieving vibrant well-being, much like optimizing our breath is about improving our fundamental vitality.
That sounds amazing. It's like they're addressing those diseases of civilization Nestor talked about by focusing on the inputs, diet, lifestyle, connection. Definitely check them out, listeners.
Indeed, a proactive, holistic approach to health is crucial. You can find them at www.sharan-india.org. That's SHARAN-India.org.
Perfect. Thanks, folks. Check out Sharan. Okay, last big takeaway from the epilogue, Sarah.
It's a synthesis, really. How we breathe matters. And Nestor lands on what he calls the, quote, perfect breath. Inhaling for about 5.5 seconds, exhaling for about 5.5 seconds. That's 5.5 breaths a minute, moving about 5.5 liters of air.
The magic 5.5.
Pretty much. He says you can do it for minutes or hours. There's no downside to peak efficiency. He mentions Anders Olsen is developing devices to help with this, and even Google has a breathing exercise tool hitting that rhythm. Breathing tech is becoming big business.
This approximately 5.5 breaths per minute rhythm corresponds to a frequency of about 0.1 hertz, which is known to maximize heart rate variability and promote autonomic balance, a state often referred to as resonance frequency breathing. It's physiologically significant.
Right. But Nestor stresses the simple approach works just as well. No gadgets needed. Just lips, nose, lungs. It's ancient technology we can access anytime, anywhere for free. He ends by describing being back in that Sudarshan Kriya class, practicing conscious breathing.
A nice full circle. Okay, fantastic overview. Let's take a few questions that have come in. First one, is mouth taping actually safe? It sounds a bit scary. Sarah, what do you think, based on the chapter?
Well, Nestor and Olsen obviously did it under supervision for the experiment. The book doesn't explicitly give safety instructions, but implies gentle tape is used. Ann Kearney at Stanford is planning a study, which suggests it's being taken seriously medically. The key takeaway is the benefit of nasal breathing it encourages. People interested should probably research specific tapes designed for this or consult a knowledgeable professional, rather than just grabbing any old tape, you know?
Good advice. Okay, next question. Can I really change my face shape just by chewing more as an adult? Ethan, what's the scientific take here?
Significant changes like widening the palate are most dramatic during growth phases. However, bone is living tissue that responds to stress. Increased masticatory load can influence bone density and potentially minor morphology even in adults. More importantly, strengthening jaw muscles and promoting proper tongue posture definitely impacts airway patency and function. So while you might not get visibly bigger jaws easily, the functional benefits related to chewing and oral posture are real and achievable.
Makes sense. Functional benefits are key. Last question. This 5.5 second perfect breath, does it work for everyone, or is it just an average? Ethan?
It's a very common resonant frequency, likely optimal for a large majority of adults due to the inherent rhythms of the cardiovascular and respiratory systems. However, individual variations can exist. Some people might find their resonant frequency slightly faster or slower, maybe 5 seconds in/out, or 6 seconds. The principle is slow, rhythmic breathing around that 0.1 hertz mark. The 5.5 is an excellent starting point and likely beneficial for almost everyone. But slight personal optimization might be possible through biofeedback, for instance.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ethan. Okay, before we wrap up, can one of you give us the absolute core takeaways from this epilogue?
Certainly. I'd distill it to 3 points. 1. Breathing techniques offer profound health benefits, particularly as preventative maintenance and for chronic conditions, but they have limitations and cannot replace urgent medical care for severe issues. 2. Modern lifestyle, especially soft diets and chronic mouth breathing, has negatively impacted our respiratory health. Consciously reverting to nasal breathing, fuller exhalations, and even increased chewing can yield significant improvements. 3. Specific, slow breathing rhythms, around 5.5 seconds in and out, maximize physiological coherence and offer a powerful, accessible tool for health, while occasional intense breathing practices can also be therapeutic.
Excellent summary, Ethan. Concise and clear. All right, folks, that's about all the time we have for this episode of Penplexity. Huge thanks to Sarah and Ethan for breathing life into this discussion.
Always a pleasure, James.
My pleasure.
So what should we get perplexed by next? Let us know. Hit us up on social media at Penplexity or visit our website, penplexity.com. We love hearing your suggestions. Until next time, keep reading, keep thinking, and maybe take a few deep, slow nasal breaths. Bye for now.